For the first 6 months of the year 1863, Union Major General William S. Rosecrans's Army of the Cumberland sat idle at Murfreesboro, Tennessee, unmoved after the Battle of Stones River, which took place between December 31st of 1862 and January 2nd of 1863. Opposing him, and also sitting fairly unmoved, was Confederate General Braxton Bragg and his Army of Tennessee. For the other major Union and Confederate armies, 1863 was a year of movement. Union Major General Ulysses S. Grant and the Army of the Tennessee maneuvered down the Mississippi River and by June was laying siege to Vicksburg, Mississippi. Confederate General Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia landed a decisive blow against the Army of the Potomac under Joseph Hooker at Chancellorsville in May, and by June was invading Pennsylvania, with the Army of the Potomac giving chase. The Lincoln administration wanted movement from Rosecrans. The Union general argued that he was doing valuable service by holding Bragg in place while the other Union armies moved. Plus, by staying put, it kept Bragg from sending reinforcements to other locations. However, that was completely false. Bragg's army had dwindled while staying at Tullahoma, Tennessee. He sent cavalry and infantry to reinforce commanders in Mississippi. Meanwhile, Rosecrans's army was growing, totaling about 80,000 men. His cavalry force had basically doubled, allowing him to screen and advance and to gather information on where the Confederate forces were located. Bragg had fewer than 50,000 men. Bragg and Rosecrans occupied locations between Murfreesboro, Tennessee and Tullahoma, Tennessee. Bragg's strong mounted arm under Nathan Bedford Forrest and Joseph Wheeler guarded the roads over which the Army of the Cumberland would have to march if that army went on the offensive. Joseph Wheeler, commander of the majority of Bragg's cavalry, got intelligence that the Union Army was on the move in mid-June. Wheeler removed Martin's cavalry from the right flank of Bragg's line and sent it to the west, to Spring Hill, to meet up with Forrest, where they would make a mad dash upon Rosecrans' supply depot in the Union rear. However, this only weakened Bragg's flank and would deprive him of needed intelligence if the Union Army moved. Rosecrans planned to swing around the Confederate Army to the east and cut Bragg's army off from its depot at Tullahoma, trapping the Army of Tennessee north of the Elk River, where it could be destroyed. On June 23rd, Rosecrans's plan went forward. First, Mitchell's cavalry pushed south toward Farmington and Shelbyville, but they encountered heavy resistance along that line, as Wheeler's cavalry remained strong in that area. Granger's Reserve Corps, right behind Mitchell, traveled northeast to Salem, along with Mitchell, who could not push past the Confederates in that sector. As Granger's corps moved, the rest of the Army of the Cumberland advanced along their planned routes. Thomas Crittenden's 21st Corps was on the far eastern prong. George Thomas's 14th Corps advanced toward Hoover's Gap. Alexander McCook's 20th Corps moved toward Liberty Gap, and Granger's Reserve Corps made up the far western prong of the advance. Liberty Gap and Hoover's Gap were occupied by cavalry, with Liberty Gap reinforced by troops from Patrick Cleburne's division. Hoover's Gap was manned by cavalry and troops from Alexander P. Stewart's division. Richard Johnson's division was tasked with pushing through Liberty Gap. August Willock's brigade led the division through Liberty Gap and came into contact with St. John Liddell's brigade of Confederates from Arkansas. Sounds of skirmishing rang out from Liberty Gap, and Johnson sent John Miller's brigade to Willock's support, placing the new brigade on the right. The defensive positions of the Arkansans allowed them to hold on despite being outnumbered, but with their flanks becoming overlapped, they withdrew. Johnson sent Philemon Baldwin's brigade in pursuit of the rebels as they moved through the gap. Baldwin's brigade engaged with the 5th Arkansas and easily pushed them back. Liddell's brigade took up a position on the heights surrounding the road. William P. Carlin's brigade also made it to the field to take the place of units who may be running low on ammunition. The next day, on June 25th, the battle continued for Liberty Gap. The 4 Union brigades formed up and began engaging with the Confederate skirmishers. Liddell requested support from his division commander Patrick Cleburne, and Cleburne dispatched Sam Wood's brigade, but it would be a while before reinforcements could get to Liddell. The lone rebel brigade commander brought up 2 more regiments to make a stand in the hope that reinforcements would arrive in time to throw back the Union attackers. The Union brigades attacked in the afternoon. Liddell's men doggedly held out for as long as they could, but it was no use against such overwhelming numbers. Liddell, without the reinforcements he needed, pulled back. Wood's brigade joined him soon after, and Cleburne began to form a strong defensive line to throw back another Union attack. As the fight for Liberty Gap was taking place to the east, George Thomas's 14th Corps was moving toward Hoover's Gap, with John T. Wilder's brigade of mounted infantry armed with Spencer repeating carbines in the lead. Wilder pushed back the light cavalry resistance at the opening of Hoover's Gap and saw that the fortifications about midway of the gap were empty. Taking advantage of the situation, Wilder pushed on to the south end of the gap. Just beyond lay the brigade of William Bate. The Confederate regiments attacked Wilder's men, but the firepower from the Yankee weaponry held the Gray troops at bay. Bate reinforced the wings of his battle line with the 9th Alabama Battalion and the 15th and 37th Consolidated Tennessee Regiment. Wilder likewise took as reserve the 17th Indiana and part of the 98th Illinois and extended his right flank. The Midwesterners held their ground. The rains all day slowed down any Confederate reinforcements, but by Sunday, Bushrod Johnson's brigade made it to the field. The next day, heavy skirmishing took place at Hoover's Gap, but no major attack was launched. During the fight, Wilder was ordered to withdraw by his division commander, but he refused, believing he could hold the ground. Also, holding the ground would make the advance of the rest of the corps much easier. When George Thomas's corps commander and the Army commander William S. Rosecrans made it to the gap, Wilder was prepared to apologize for disobeying orders, but both men told him that he saved thousands of lives with his actions. Without his cavalry to the east, Bragg didn't know that Rosecrans was trying to move around his flank. The heavy fighting at Liberty Gap made Bragg think that the main thrust was coming from that direction, so he wanted Leonidas Polk, one of his corps commanders, to push north and attack the Union force at Liberty Gap from the rear, while Hardee attacked the force at Hoover's Gap from the south and east. Polk wasn't able to move out before Bragg called off the attack. Word that Hoover's Gap was captured led the Army commander to order a complete withdrawal of his forces toward Tullahoma. The rains and the arduous job of climbing into the Cumberland Plateau made the marching horrible for both the Union and the Confederate armies. Rosecrans was attempting to get his forces to Manchester and then cut off Bragg's retreat and trap him north of the Elk River, but the delays due to the weather allowed Polk and Hardee's corps to get to Tullahoma. In Shelbyville, the cavalry screening the movements of Polk got defeated by Union horsemen. Bragg began to prepare for an engagement at Tullahoma. He asked his two corps commanders what he should do. Polk said to retreat to Chattanooga, and Hardee was inclined to wait and see what the Union were going to do next. Meanwhile, Rosecrans's forces concentrated at Manchester. Wilder's brigade of mounted infantry made a dash upon Bragg's right flank at Deckard, destroying Confederate supplies and any infrastructure to slow down Bragg's troops. He then pressed on to the University of the South that was started by Leonidas Polk. This raid by Wilder scared Bragg, making him think that the Federals were already on his flank, so he finally ordered his men to fall back toward Chattanooga. Although he didn't trap Bragg's army, Rosecrans's Tullahoma campaign was an impressive feat. Within a few days, with little fighting and simply outmaneuvering his Confederate opponent, Rosecrans and the Army of the Cumberland brought Middle Tennessee under Union control and drove the Army of Tennessee to Chattanooga. Combine the successful Tullahoma campaign with the major Union victory at Gettysburg and the surrender of a large Confederate garrison at Vicksburg, June and July 1863 was a major turning point for the Union and its war effort. Union General William S. Rosecrans and the Army of the Cumberland had maneuvered Braxton Bragg's Confederate Army of Tennessee out of their positions southeast of Nashville during the Tullahoma Campaign. Now, Rosecrans was focused on the city of Chattanooga, Tennessee, a vital railroad hub for the Confederacy. His intention was to fool Bragg into thinking that he was going to cross the Tennessee River upriver, but was in actuality moving his army south of Chattanooga to cross Lookout Mountain to get in the rear of Bragg's army. Most of Bragg's forces were concentrated near Chattanooga, with his cavalry spread out in a wide net across the landscape. He was outnumbered significantly, with about 50,000 men in his army, as opposed to the approximately 70,000 men in the Army of the Cumberland. Bragg's cavalry under Joseph Wheeler were tasked with watching the river crossings downstream of Chattanooga, but Wheeler sent most of his troops to rest camps far from the scenes of action, so Bragg knew little about the Union Army movements to the south. The Union main thrust began on August 29, 1863. By September 5th, the Army of the Cumberland had crossed the Tennessee River, a success for Rosecrans. Alexander McCook's 20th Corps was at the south end of the line, George Thomas's 14th Corps was in the center, and Thomas L. Crittenden's 21st Corps was to the north, converging on Chattanooga. Bragg was in a horrible state mentally because he had no good information on which gap in Lookout Mountain the Union Army would emerge from. On September 7th, Bragg began to move his army south for fear of getting cut off from Atlanta. This left the Union in control of Chattanooga. Crittenden's troops pushed southeast toward Tunnel Hill, Georgia, while McCook's corps approached the Confederate army from the south. George Thomas's corps worked its way over Lookout Mountain and was about to enter McLemore's Cove. Rosecrans's plan involved and relied on his army getting to Lafayette. On September 10th, Negley's division moved into McLemore's Cove, with Thomas being extremely cautious, knowing that at least part of his corps could be isolated and destroyed if the Confederates acted quickly. Luckily for him, the Southern Army was in full confusion. Bragg had sent Claiborne's division, Heineman's division, and elements of Simon Bolivar Buckner's corps to trap Thomas's men in McLemore's Cove. Colonel William Sirwell's brigade led the way into the cove, followed by Colonel Timothy R. Stanley's brigade. The two colonels found Confederate cavalry posted in the cove, and General Negley wanted to force them out, so Sirwell's men pushed forward and drove the cavalry to the foot of Dug Gap. But as his men got close to the gap, the resistance increased. The Union infantry got close enough to see that the Confederate infantry had fortified the gap. Sirwell pulled back to a safe distance. Those rebels in the gap were commanded by Major General Patrick Claiborne, who was waiting for General Heineman to launch an attack from the northwest. Then the Irishman was to deliver a devastating blow to the unsuspecting Federals. At about that time, Negley received word that a large Confederate column was approaching from the north. To mask his withdrawal closer to Lookout Mountain, Negley ordered Sirwell and Stanley to push back the rebel skirmishers. Then at 3 a.m., with no Confederates in sight, they pulled back to a ridge around the Davis House. Negley asked his corps commander, George Thomas, for reinforcements, and by 8:30 a.m., elements of Baird's division arrived. Scribner replaced Sirwell's brigade, while that brigade moved to the left, and Starkweather moved into Stanley's position. Braxton Bragg had ordered a 6 a.m. attack by his division commanders north of McLemore's Cove, and Claiborne waited for that attack to commence so that he could launch his own assault, but no attack came. Generals Heineman and Buckner began to fear that they could not attack in their condition, and that they may be attacked themselves or even outnumbered, so they delayed even further. It was 5 p.m., 11 hours after Bragg had wanted an attack to begin, before the Confederate divisions of Simon Bolivar Buckner pressed down the road toward Negley and Baird's men. By that time, the delay in attacking had given Thomas enough time to pull most of his two divisions through Stevens Gap to safety, along with the wagon train, leaving only a small force to cover the retreat, and that is the only force that Buckner's men came into contact with. The Confederates made a weak attempt at attacking the heels of the Union Army, but to no avail. The Battle of Davis's Crossroads was over. To the north, over the course of those same 2 days, Union forces clashed with Confederates at Graysville on September 10th and Lee's Tanyard on September 11th, as each side attempted to find out where the other was. McCook, to the south, knew he was to meet up with Thomas near Lafayette, but as he moved closer, Confederate resistance became stronger, and with Thomas nowhere in sight, he concluded that he would need to move back across Lookout Mountain. To the north, Crittenden's men were coming together. Bragg sent orders to Polk to attack the Union Corps, but Polk saw that he was outnumbered and declined to attack. Although McCook retreated from Lafayette, Bragg was still concerned about a possible attack from that sector and sent Buckner's troops to march south to link up with John Breckinridge. Not content with having Breckinridge and Buckner at Lafayette, he had Polk and Walker also do the long march, further exhausting his army. However, Bragg would get great news. The threat to the south was gone. Rosecrans and General Ambrose Burnside in East Tennessee had not linked up, and troops under Lieutenant General James Longstreet from the Army of Northern Virginia were on their way to reinforce him. Bragg then moved his army north to confront Rosecrans, who was concentrating his army at Lee and Gordon's Mill. On September 18th, Braxton Bragg wanted his Confederate army to cross West Chickamauga Creek at various locations north of the Union main line and cut it off from Chattanooga, and by attacking its left flank, drive it south. Guarding the fords and bridges across the creek were Federal cavalry under Colonel Robert Minty and mounted infantry equipped with Spencer repeating rifles under Colonel John T. Wilder. To the north, Minty would come into contact with elements of Longstreet's corps under Brigadier General Bushrod Johnson. The Confederate infantry didn't have cavalry to scout ahead of them, so Johnson sent out Colonel Fulton's brigade to probe the Union position. Around this time, General Nathan Bedford Forrest arrived with a handful of his cavalry, and began working his way around the flank of Minty's line. Just before noon, Minty withdrew closer to the bridge to shore up his battle line. Minty could see dust clouds rising up to the northeast and feared that Confederate troops would attempt to outflank him using the bridges and fords to the north, so he asked Wilder for help. Wilder sent Minty part of his brigade to watch those locations while Minty engaged with Forrest and Johnson. Forrest would take Fulton's 17th Tennessee and his own cavalry to the south in an attempt to capture what he thought was Minty's camp. When Johnson and Fulton crossed a ridge, they could see how small the Union force was, so Johnson called up for Gregg's brigade to align on Fulton's right and McNair to fall in behind to act in a supporting role for the other two brigades. Braxton Bragg's plan to quickly cross the creek and unite his army on the other side for a major assault in order to flank the Union left and be able to push it further south had hit a snag at Reed's Bridge. While Johnson worked to outflank Minty, Wilder's men guarded Alexander's Bridge to the south. After sending aid to Minty, Wilder only had Company F and A of the 72nd Indiana, 5 companies of the 98th Illinois, and the 17th Indiana to guard his sector. He also had many men posted at various fords along the creek so that the Confederates could not launch a surprise flanking maneuver. Brigadier General St. John Liddell ordered Walthall's Mississippi Brigade forward to take the bridge. However, the thick underbrush disrupted the brigade's battle lines, and each regiment arrived at different times. Plus, Company A of the 72nd Indiana had ripped up the floor of the bridge and created a breastwork out of its pieces. Although some of the Mississippians made it into the creek and attempted to outflank the outnumbered Federals, the firepower from the Spencer rifles created a bloody stalemate. By a little after noon, the Confederates had thrown elements of 2 divisions against the 2 diminished Union brigades and hadn't been able to drive off the stubborn Federals, and the day was quickly passing. Bragg had planned for them to already be across the creek and well on their way attacking the Union from a northerly direction. To the north, Minty had pulled back across Reed's Bridge, giving ground each time that Johnson's infantry aligned themselves for an attack. Minty's men had ripped up the planks after crossing and threw them into the creek below, which carried them downstream. Johnson now had to work to get across Chickamauga Creek, all the while under fire from Union's small arms and artillery fire. The 23rd Tennessee ripped boards from the Reed house and barn and repaired the bridge. Fulton's troops formed up, with skirmishers providing cover fire against Union musketry, and filed across the bridge to the other side. Gregg's men waited across the creek to the north so that they could form on Fulton's right. Meanwhile, Forrest's cavalry used 2 fords upstream to cross the creek and finally made it to the west side of the waterway. However, it was late in the day, and both Minty and Wilder knew that they were soon to be flanked if they stayed where they were, so they pulled back nearly 2 miles. Johnson was now under the direct command of Major General John Bell Hood, who had just arrived on the field with his arm still in a sling from his wounding at Gettysburg. Walker's divisions abandoned the attempt to cross at Alexander's Bridge and moved downstream and crossed there. Additionally, Buckner's 2 divisions were beginning to cross the creek. Hood and Johnson pushed south after crossing the creek, and there would be one more stand before darkness covered the field. Wilder held a position east of Vineyard Field and asked Minty to form on his right. Major General Thomas Crittenden and one of his division commanders, Brigadier General Thomas J. Wood, arrived on the field and concluded that no further attack would be made and that there was no substantial Confederate force on that side of the creek. Earlier, when Minty reported to Crittenden about Longstreet's corps being at Ringgold, Crittenden had brushed the information aside, declaring that Longstreet was still in Virginia. Wood examined Wilder's line, and as he did, Johnson's division came into view. Wood frantically rode off to alert Crittenden, who ordered the closest Federal brigade to Wilder's aid. That would be Colonel George F. Dick's brigade of Horatio Van Cleve's 3rd Division. Johnson's men rushed forward and attacked Wilder's line, but like most night battles of the war, not much came of the attacks, and the firing faded away as Johnson withdrew his men a short distance and had them build impromptu breastworks. Together, the small commands of Minty and Wilder had delayed vastly superior Confederate columns for hours, and by extension, threw the timetable for Braxton Bragg's attack plan off schedule an entire day. Although the Confederate advance had been delayed, Rosecrans' Army of the Cumberland could still be cut off from Chattanooga. With that scary thought in his mind, Rosecrans turned to his most trusted commander, Major General George Thomas, to extend Crittenden's left to the north and secure the Lafayette Road, which was their connection with Chattanooga. By dawn, Thomas had brought the divisions of Brigadier Generals Absalom Baird and John M. Brannan to the Kelly House and farmstead. They had marched most of the night and when they arrived, began to cook breakfast. The night before, Colonel Daniel McCook arrived near Reed's Bridge to help in the defense of that sector, but arrived once the majority of the fighting was over. He did take some prisoners, but was ordered by his commander, Gordon Granger, to fall back to Rossville. Before he left, some of his Ohioans tried to burn Reed's Bridge, but Confederates in the area put it out before any damage was done. Since most of McCook's prisoners were from one brigade, he surmised that a lone Southern brigade was trapped on the west side of the creek. He informed Thomas of that when he pulled back to Rossville. Thomas wasted no time and moved Brannan's men forward, who were still in the process of cooking their breakfast. The only rebels in the immediate area was a brigade of cavalry ultimately under Forrest, but commanded by Brigadier General Henry Davidson, who had been sent to that sector when it was discovered that McCook's men were attempting to burn the bridge. The brigades of Colonels John T. Croxton and Ferdinand Vanderveer approached Jay's Mill along two roads, attempting to find the lone Confederate brigade described by McCook. Croxton ran into the 10th Confederate Cavalry, and Vanderveer hit the 1st Georgia Cavalry. Forrest realized he couldn't hold back two Federal brigades with the men he had, so he instructed his men to hold as long as possible until infantry support could be brought up. The Wizard of the Saddle sent notes to Bragg, General Walker, and Walker's brigade commanders, and all obliged to send help. The brigades of Colonel Claudius Wilson and Brigadier General Matthew Ector marched north to help Forrest throw back the Union brigades. Wilson formed on Forrest's left, with Ector instructed to keep marching north to tackle Union forces coming down the Reed's Bridge Road. Wilson pushed towards Croxton's line, who was surprised with such a large force meeting him and saw that his right could be outflanked, so he began to move the 10th Kentucky in that direction. But while the 10th was moving behind the 74th Indiana, the Hoosiers confused the Kentuckians' orders with their own and thought they were to perform a general retreat and fled about 200 yards to the rear. Croxton worked to reorganize the 74th, and while he did that, the 10th Kentucky performed a brave charge to send back Wilson's brigade, which provided Croxton with enough time to get the 74th back in line with the rest of the brigade. Croxton had been falling back gradually as the Confederate brigades came closer and closer, hoping that Vanderveer would come up on his left so that his line would be more secure. But Ector's movements would prevent that juncture. The skirmishers in front of Brannan had done a spectacular job of stopping the Union advance, and now that Ector was ready to attack, the situation seemed dire for the Union. The rebel brigade rushed forward, but the artillery from Battery I of the 4th U.S. Battery, positioned in between Vanderveer's regiments, along with an incredible volley of musketry, forced Ector back. It was a significant blow to the rebels. Meanwhile, Brannan realized his brigades were heavily engaged and sought to reinforce them at once. He took his last brigade, that under Colonel John Connell, and divided it. He sent the 31st Ohio to help Croxton, while he personally led the rest of the brigade and the 4th Michigan Battery to Vanderveer's aid. Ector made another attack, but it was just as costly as the first. Every mounted officer lost a horse. 2 regimental commanders went down along with a number of flag bearers. Colonel William H. Young of the 9th Texas received a bullet to his chest, his second of 5 wounds he would receive during the entire war. The attacks, although unsuccessful for the Confederates, moved Vanderveer's line to where it faced more south than east. It was 10 a.m. and Brannan had thrown in all of his brigades, so he sent word to General Thomas for additional reinforcements. Thomas called up for Baird to come to Brannan's assistance. Meanwhile, Ector grew concerned about more Union regiments in his front, and particularly his right flank. He told Forrest about his concern for that area, and Forrest replied, "Tell General Ector that he need not bother about his right flank. I'll take care of it." To the south, one of Baird's brigades, under Colonel Benjamin Scribner, charged into Wilson's left flank, shattering it completely. Wilson ran over to that flank and tried to rally what was left, but to no avail. His right crumbled after that. Scribner's brigade got broken up by the successful charge, and its commander had trouble putting them back together. Ector kept up the pressure against Connell and Vanderveer, but he was not expecting what happened next. Ector told Forrest about his exposed left flank, and Forrest sent word back, "Tell General Ector that by God I am here, and I will take care of his left flank as well as his right." Unfortunately for Forrest and Ector, the cavalry commander did not have enough troops to do that. Brigadier General John H. King's brigade slammed into Ector's flank and sent the Confederates running. Many of Ector's men were captured by King's men. Thomas's division had thrown back 2 brigades of Confederates, and his brigades reorganized themselves after the successful attacks. At that point, a short lull came over the battlefield. It was 11 a.m., and both sides had begun to reinforce their lines, preparing for what may come. George Thomas asked Rosecrans for more reinforcements, which Rosecrans happily gave. Brigadier General Richard W. Johnson's division and Major General John M. Palmer's division moved north to support Thomas's expanding line. Bragg was now heavily concerned about his own battle line, as his plan to push the Union Army south away from Chattanooga had been unsuccessful. The rest of William Walker's corps swung north to engage Thomas's successful troops. Bragg's left was secure under Generals Hood, Buckner, and Cheatham, so he detached Cheatham's division of Polk's corps and sent it north to add to Walker's left. Scribner and the other Federal brigades under Thomas were busy celebrating their recent victory when Walthall and Govan's men attacked. They were told that there would be reinforcements coming from the southwest, so not to fire on them, but this was the enemy. Battery A of the 1st Michigan Artillery held on with the help of the 10th Wisconsin for a short time. The commander of the artillery, Lieutenant George Van Pelt, died defending the guns against the advancing rebels, but eventually all the Federals were forced to pull back. Starkweather didn't have time to change the front of his brigade before the gray lines wrapped around his flanks. The brigade, made up of men from Wisconsin, Illinois, and Pennsylvania, held out for a short time, but they too fell back in disorder. Now there were no Federal units between Govan and Walthall's men and the flank and rear of King's regulars. Baird arrived in time to tell King to orient part of his brigade to the south, but it was too late. He had only managed to get his battle line to partially face in that direction before the Confederates swarmed over the landscape, capturing a great many of the blue-clad troops. King alone lost around 500 as prisoners, over 1/3 of the fighting force he brought into the engagement. In less than 30 minutes, the 2 Confederate brigades had devastated the Union's left flank, but the disorganization from their success and the casualties accumulated from the attacks was wearing on them. Walthall's men continued forward and attacked Connell's depleted brigade. However, the 9th Ohio, made up mostly of German immigrants in Cincinnati, had been left behind to guard the wagons, but Connell brought them to the front to reinforce the rest of his brigade. When the Mississippians came forward, without orders, the Germans charged forward with a yell, stunning the exhausted rebels. The attack was so unexpected and even a surprise to Connell that they drove the Mississippians away. To the east, Croxton's brigade, fresh from the rear, where they filled their cartridge boxes and rested, had marched south upon hearing the sound of battle, and seeing that their comrades were retreating in disorder. Once he was in position, Croxton ordered a bayonet charge that drove Govan's men away. A private in Croxton's brigade recalled later that Croxton ordered a bayonet charge, which was performed in a style never surpassed and scarcely ever equaled, driving them in the wildest confusion, actually running clear through their lines and capturing many prisoners. Scribner, King, Vanderveer, and Connell guarded the Reed's Bridge Road, and Nathan Bedford Forrest was going to attempt to outflank the Union along that road. As he moved Dibrell's brigade to the northwest, so moved Vanderveer and Connell to meet the threat. When the rebel cavalry attacked, the infantry line, studded with artillery, convinced the attackers to fall back in great haste and signaled to Forrest that the line was too strong at the moment to turn it. The fighting in this sector died down around noon. Walker's reserve corps had been bloodied significantly, and the divisions of Baird and Brannan had eventually repulsed the attackers, but at a great cost. Most of the Union divisions pulled back, leaving only Croxton out front after chasing Govan's men back toward West Chickamauga Creek. This lull, like the other, would be short as Cheatham's fresh division moved out. By midday, Braxton Bragg was still trying to find and possibly turn the left flank of the Union Army to his north, but the stiff resistance in that sector had confounded him. Most of the fighting up until that point had been exploratory probes by each side. The rest of the Union line was fairly thin, with Rosecrans waiting on the rest of his troops to make it to the field. Major General Benjamin Cheatham's division was sent by Bragg to support Walker's troops, but Walker's rebels had been pushed from the field. Croxton's brigade was out front of the Union line. It sat astride the Brotherton Road, with 3 regiments north of the road and 3 regiments south of it. The Federals didn't expect to see any Confederates after the last ones they sent back. Similarly, Brigadier General John K. Jackson did not expect to find Federals so close to his position when he moved out. He was expecting to encounter elements of Walker's regiments he had been sent to support. When the Southerners saw the Federals, Jackson wasted no time and ordered a charge, which sent back the right half of the brigade, but Croxton was able to keep them together and bring back the left as well, setting up a defensive position on a small ridge. Croxton didn't have to wait long for help to arrive. Johnson and Palmer's divisions had been ordered to Thomas's aid, and Old Pap Thomas sent them into battle as soon as they were available. In the front right of Johnson's battle line was the brigade of Brigadier General August Willock, a German immigrant who, at a young age, adopted the ideas of socialism and communism, and even challenged Karl Marx himself to a duel when they disagreed on that movement's course of action. In Palmer's left front was the brigade under Brigadier General William B. Hazen, one of the most capable Union brigade commanders in the Army of the Cumberland. His stubborn stand at the Round Forest at Stones River helped save the Union Army and its hold on the Nashville Pike. Those units faced a fresh and veteran force in the form of Cheatham's division. Johnson and Palmer moved through and beside Croxton, sending back Jackson's brigade. Palmer refused his right flank per the orders of Rosecrans, who knew the biggest problem facing the Federal units in that area was Confederates attacking from a southward direction. When Jackson fell back, he came on line with Brigadier General Preston Smith's brigade. Both advanced on the two Union divisions. By this point in the war, Union tactics had changed to brigades putting 2 regiments in front and 2 in back. This helped stabilize their lines during an attack, but Confederates were still placing their regiments side by side, which meant their battle lines were less stable, but they could overlap the Union battle lines more easily. On the Confederate left, Brigadier General Marcus Wright was moving his brigade toward the right. However, Wright mistakenly thought he was in the center of Cheatham's line and was expecting a brigade to come up on his left. Wright was new to brigade command in combat, and his promotion over one of the brigade's colonels irritated its troops. Before he knew it, Wright ran into Gross's brigade. Smith and Jackson's men were feeling overmatched, especially Smith, who had attempted to attack the Union line through Brock Field, and his exposed condition led to heavy casualties. At 1:30 p.m., he pulled back to the other end of the field and sent word to his division commander that his ammunition was running low, but that he could hold on long enough for another brigade to relieve him. Cheatham quickly ordered up support. Brigadier General Otho Strahl and Brigadier General George Maney would replace Smith and Jackson. For Strahl, Cheatham told him not to advance through the field, but to take up a position in the trees on the south end of it. But he did just the opposite, marching into the field. Strahl quickly realized his mistake when his men began taking heavy casualties. Adding to the confusion, a fire broke out in the field, and the smoke flew into the eyes of the Confederate soldiers. Quickly, Strahl moved them out of the desperate situation. To the north, George Maney, a Tennessean, veteran of the Mexican-American War, and a proven tough fighter for the Army of Tennessee, relieved Jackson's battered lines. Cheatham was obviously confused. He went in thinking he would find the Union left flank, but was met by large numbers of Federals coming in a direction he did not anticipate, and his men were getting mauled. To the west, Rosecrans prepared to send more troops into the ever-extending battle line. Part of Horatio Van Cleve's division attacked to the east of the Lafayette Road and slammed into Wright's left flank. 2 of his regiments did attempt to turn to engage the arriving Federals, and Karn's battery wheeled about and delivered double canister into the blue ranks, but it only delayed the Union advance that sent Wright's men backpedaling to the east. Bragg, seeing the deteriorating situation, had pulled a division from Simon Bolivar Buckner's corps under Alexander P. Stewart and sent it to his right. They were coming into position as Wright was pulling back. The conglomeration of various corps on the Confederate right would make the chain of command confusing over the course of the next couple of days. Elements of 3 different corps were engaging in that sector, and Bragg placed Polk in command of that wing, even though only one division, Cheatham's, belonged to his actual command. On the Confederate right and Union left, both sides were running low on ammunition, so those blue and gray troops needed to be relieved or find some way to throw back the enemy. Colonel Joseph Dodge came up from the reserve, and the brigades of Willock and Baldwin began to push against Strahl and Maney. Willock utilized his advanced fire technique, where his regiments were formed into 4 rows, and the front row would fire, the second row would advance through the first row and fire, then the third would advance through the first and second rows and fire, and so on. This created a constant wall of musketry. which pushed the Confederates off the field. The Union left was holding firm and threw back every attempt to dislodge them from their position, but Confederate reinforcements were headed toward the Lafayette Road. Alexander P. Stewart was a graduate of West Point in 1842 and only served 3 years in the peacetime army before resigning to become a college professor. His division was not spread out like Cheatham's. He had lined his brigades up, one behind the other. Brigadier General Henry Clayton's brigade led the division, and even though it only had 3 regiments, it was the largest brigade in the division, mostly because the 38th and 36th Alabama regiments had spent the war guarding Mobile and had yet to hear guns fired in anger. The Alabamians advanced on Van Cleve's men, but even though their flank was turned toward Gross's brigade, they were too far away from the Federal bullets to do major damage. The Confederate line pushed the front line of Beatty and Dick's brigades, but the second line held firm, and it broke down into a static firefight between the two groups. Despite their inexperience, Clayton's men stood their ground and withstood the rage of battle until their cartridge boxes became empty. He reported this to Stewart, who replaced Clayton with Brown's brigade. The flames from the rifled muskets and cannons ignited the dry foliage, and smoke and flames concealed friend and foe. Nevertheless, each side threw lead at one another, trying to make the other break. Major General Joseph Reynolds had sent his brigades to other sectors and was left with Edward King's brigade and 2 regiments. He sent King to the right to provide support for Van Cleve's line, leaving him in command of only 2 regiments. When the 6th Ohio came to the rear to look for ammunition wagons, Reynolds took them in as his reserve, but he wouldn't have those 3 regiments for long. A gap in the line forced him to send the 75th Indiana into the breach. It was about 3 p.m., and the battle was still raging. Brigades and divisions who had taken part in the battle rested, and those yet not engaged were being brought to the front. The battle was starting to shift southward. Braxton Bragg had exhausted his forces occupying his right, so he would now use Hood's men, who occupied the center. The area across from Hood's men was fairly open. Rosecrans had attempted to fill that gap in his line all day, but troops had been diverted to the hotly contested area to the north. Part of the division under General Jefferson C. Davis would be thrust into that sector, and a deadly firefight would emerge. As the brigades of King, Dick, and Beatty fought off the repeated assaults against their lines by Alexander P. Stewart, General Jefferson C. Davis's division deployed just to the south to help protect the Lafayette Road. Davis pulled 2 regiments from Carlin's brigade and made the 21st Illinois part of the divisional reserves, while the 81st Indiana, under an inexperienced regimental commander, helped guard the 2nd Minnesota Battery. Haig's brigade, which contained the 15th Wisconsin, also known as the Scandinavian Regiment because of its ranks being filled with Norwegians, Swedes, and Danes, moved into the timber, not knowing what awaited them inside the woods. They ran into the divisions of Bushrod Johnson and Evander Law. Despite the overwhelming numerical superiority, Johnson didn't order his men forward, at least not at the moment. Haig brought up his reserve to extend his line to the south. Finally, Davis sent Carlin's 21st Illinois to help stabilize Haig's line. But the pressure was compounding, which forced Davis to send in the rest of the brigade to the right of Haig. Both brigades put up a strong fight against the Southerners, but help was coming from the south. Colonel Sidney Barnes's brigade was coming up the Lafayette Road. Major General John Bell Hood became impatient. He had waited most of the day, and now that the enemy was in his front, he would press them. He ordered his 2 divisions forward. However, a horrible series of miscommunications between the brigades led to a jumbled mass of Confederates that lost valuable strength for an attack. Gregg was supposed to stay connected to Fulton's left, but Gregg's left was engaged with Haig and couldn't break away, which resulted in the 3rd and 41st Tennessee joining Fulton, while the others remained to the south. Furthermore, Law was either ordered or thought he was ordered to the southwest. Sheffield, part of Law's division, disconnected from the rest of the division and attacked the Union line alongside Stewart's division. The overall Union line that stretched alongside the Lafayette Road and jutted out along the Brotherton Road had now been split by Hood's actions. Once into the breach, Confederate forces would spread out, with some heading north while others headed south. To the south, the brigades of Robertson, Benning, McNair, part of Gregg's, and some others would fight against the divisions of Jefferson C. Davis, Thomas J. Wood, and Philip Sheridan. Haig's line held out for as long as possible and concentrated just north of Vineyard Field. However, the Confederates who passed by his flank sent the 35th Illinois running to the rear, until they could regroup. Forming behind Haig's line in support was Harker's brigade. Wood, the division commander, was attempting to form on Van Cleve's right, but when the Confederates began to break through the line, he quickly threw his men into the engagement, with the 3rd Kentucky and 125th Ohio refusing the battle line to the north as part of Gregg's brigade started to engage Haig and Harker. On the Union right, Barnes's brigade, marching diagonally toward what he thought was the Confederate flank, was hit with an enfilading fire from the right. The musketry was so deadly that it sent Barnes's men through Carlin's troops, who was so disturbed by the rush of retreating comrades that they too fell back. This afforded Trigg's brigade of Virginians and Floridians to capture multiple batteries of artillery. Trigg ordered his troops forward, but only the 6th Florida followed. A miscommunication led to the 54th Virginia and the 7th Florida to go north to support Robertson's brigade. Nevertheless, the 6th had a chance to capture a significant number of Union guns. However, the quick-thinking Colonel Wilder and Colonel George P. Buell sent elements of their brigades to stop the Floridians and send them back across Vineyard Field. Wilder knew that the situation was beginning to deteriorate, so he recalled his regiments back to his original line and turned his attention to the north. The 25th Arkansas, 39th North Carolina, 30th Tennessee, and 7th Texas had pushed across the Lafayette Road, threatening the flank and rear of Davis and Wood's divisions. Wilder acted fast, sending the 98th Illinois north to confront the invading rebels, along with turning the guns of Captain Eli Lilly's 18th Indiana Light Artillery to confront them. Similarly, Harker's men moved north. The troops under McNair and Gregg realized they could nearly be surrounded and pulled back across the road. A major Confederate attack had been thrown back, but there was another one coming. Brigadier General Jerome Robertson's brigade slammed into the beleaguered Union troops, sending many of them running for the rear. A few of them did stand their ground, but the fresh Confederate brigade was too strong. However, when Robertson's regiments turned to fight Wilder's men, the Union colonel's position allowed him to deliver devastating volleys from their Spencer repeating rifles into the men from Texas and Arkansas. Wilder ultimately halted Robertson, who called for Hood to send him support. Brigadier General Henry L. Benning was close behind Robertson and would lend the much-needed help. Wilder's front was protected by a stream bed about halfway between his defensive barricade at the tree line and the Lafayette Road. The dry weather of the past few weeks had evaporated the water, so most of the men who described it referred to the bed as a ditch or the dry ditch. The banks were steep, cut into the field about 5 feet deep. The ditch angled across the field from southeast to the northwest, growing shallower as it wound its way north. For many, it would become known as the Ditch of Death. When Benning moved into the field to combat Wilder, Wilder's troops kneeled in double ranks and poured lead into the Georgians from the repeaters, while other regiments from the shattered divisions stood behind them in double ranks firing their single-shot rifled muskets. This hail of lead sent the Georgians into the ditch. They sought refuge there, and it did provide some protection against the Union bullets. Wilder wanted to get the enemy out of that ditch, which partially protected them from his troops' volleys. So he sent Lilly's battery to the flank of Benning's men and fired down the line of Georgians, causing great havoc in the rebel line. Benning left roughly a third of his force in the ditch before he began a withdrawal. Elements from many of the Federal brigades previously sent fleeing behind Wilder's line formed into ranks and, sensing the great opportunity to land a devastating blow to the retreating enemy, burst into the field, but the action did not go as well as hoped. The Georgians still had fight in them and slowly gave ground. Eventually, all of the units, both Union and Confederate, withdrew to safety. As the chaos of battle consumed the Vineyard Field and the Ditch of Death, Federal troops to the north of the breakthrough were also fighting for their lives. When Major General John Bell Hood's corps moved forward and broke through the Union line, Evander Law's division and part of Bushrod Johnson's division engaged the divisions of Jefferson C. Davis, Thomas J. Wood, and Philip Sheridan. To the north, the rest of Johnson's division, along with Alexander P. Stewart's division, smashed into the Union line. Johnson's division swung around the flank of King, Beatty, and Dick's brigades, while Bates' brigade moved against Gross's brigade. Behind the Union line, Major General Joseph Reynolds, whose brigades had been plucked from his division and placed at different locations, possessed only the 6th Ohio and 92nd Illinois, and he had only gotten those by picking them up as they came to the rear for ammunition, as in the case with the 6th. He also had assembled 16 artillery pieces perched on a rise in the Brotherton Field. When the Union line broke under the pressure of the Confederate assault, many regiments either partially or wholly rallied around those guns. Had Brown's brigade pushed forward instead of falling back because he thought he was unsupported, the Union line may have been lost. Reynolds remembered the moment by saying, "I remember seeing Van Cleve telling the boys to go slow, trying to stop his men. They were being driven, but I could not see who was driving them. They were not firing but were going to the northward in the rear of my line." For King's brigade, it was a complete rout, and the situation was turning deadly for the entire Union Army if the attack could not be thwarted. Horatio Van Cleve rode north to find troops to stop the rebels. He came across Brigadier General William B. Hazen's brigade and began bringing them south. In the Brotherton Field, the situation was getting worse for the Union. Clayton and Fulton's brigades pushed forward, threatening the flank of the 92nd Illinois, who retreated back to their mounts. This created a chain reaction. With their flanks unsupported, each regiment gave way as the Confederate troops moved through the Brotherton Field. Only Hazen's brigade was able to hold on to the ground. Just to the east, Colonel Gross's brigade was about to be hit by a large Confederate attack, and even worse, they were running low on ammunition. The 6th Ohio had already ran low and went to the Lafayette Road to refill their cartridge boxes. When Bates' brigade approached Gross's line, the musketry raged between the two sides as the Union troops desperately held on. Gross moved the 36th Indiana from a supportive role to the front line to help alleviate the pressure on the other regiments. However, it was to no avail. The Confederates were just too numerous, and the breakthrough at the Brotherton Field forced Gross to pull his men back in order to save his battle line. The Union center was shattered. The success of the Confederate brigades caused a great confusion on the battlefield, though. A lack of communication between the brigade commanders made each leader afraid they had pushed too far without support, and some were fighting alongside units they were not supposed to be fighting with. Sheffield's brigade was a mess, and its deteriorating situation only added to the growing confusion within the Confederate ranks. The bulk of Sheffield's Alabama brigade arrived in Brotherton Field. These regiments were supposed to be fighting alongside Benning and Robertson's brigades, which were engaged a mile south around the Vineyard Field, but had failed to keep that connection, drifting to the northwest instead. When an artillery round unhorsed Sheffield early in the advance, command should have went to Colonel Perry of the 44th Alabama, but that regiment had gotten disconnected from the brigade and was fighting with Stewart's division. Colonel William C. Oates ultimately took command of the bulk of those troops, leading them into Brotherton Field. When Colonel Charles Harker's Union Brigade advanced from the south in an attempt to throw back Confederate forces west of the Lafayette Road, the disorganized rebels were taken by surprise. Brigadier General John Gregg was wounded by a 64th Ohio skirmisher and left for dead, but the Southern general would recover from his wounds. As the Union soldiers passed by, they relieved him of many articles, including his sword. With Federal soldiers in their rear, this convinced the two regiments under Gregg to fall back across the road, and Fulton began to turn his regiments toward the south to address the growing problem in that sector. To the north, Bates' successful brigade continued its push to the northwest, chasing routed Federal batteries. 3 Union batteries and the 75th Indiana sat at the edge of Poe Field, awaiting the Confederate regiments to appear through the tree line. When the gray lines emerged, a destructive fire of artillery and musketry encompassed the field. A member of Bates' brigade recalled that some regiments were almost annihilated. The artillery knocked a hole so large in the 37th Georgia that it split into 2 units, one headed to the left and one headed to the right. Bates' men couldn't handle the hail of iron and lead and withdrew back into the woods, close to the Brotherton Road. Brigadier General John B. Turchin, a Russian immigrant who had served in the Imperial Russian Army before coming to the United States and settling in Chicago, was a tough fighter, and since there was silence in his front, he deployed to the west and attacked the right flank of the Confederate breakthrough. However, Turchin's men did not pursue the enemy. They withdrew to their stable battle line. While all this was going on, Rosecrans and Thomas were attempting to shore up the breakthrough. Brannan's brigades were approaching from the north, and Negley's fresh division was deploying just to the west of the Lafayette Road into the Brotherton Field. A soldier from that division remembered, "The battle was raging fiercely in the forest along the Chickamauga. Batteries of artillery and brigades of infantry were moving on double quick to the support of our forces on the battle lines. We could see the smoke of battle rising above the trees, almost shutting out our view of the forest, while the roar of artillery and rattle of musketry was deafening." Negley sent his 2 brigades west and sent back the rebels under Clayton. They were the only ones still holding a position west of the Lafayette Road. It was about 6 p.m., and the rebel threats in Vineyard Field to the south had been contained, and the breakthrough at the Brotherton Field was thrown back. Both sides came to rest near the place they had ended their fight. Rosecrans had mostly reacted to Confederate attacks the entire day, and as a result, the chain of command was disorganized, with only George Thomas commanding a coherent organization of troops on the north end of the field. Braxton Bragg had committed a lot of divisions into the fight, but he still had some that had yet to fire a shot in the battle. Patrick Cleburne's division had just arrived on the field, as well as Thomas Hindman's division. Before night completely covered the battlefield, Confederate forces would launch one more attack. Cheatham's earlier retreat around Winfrey and Brock Field caused Leonidas Polk, the general in charge of that sector, great concern. He hoped to throw back the Federal divisions in his front and help stabilize the overall Confederate line, as Stuart's brigades were pushing into the Union rear during the breakthrough. They would be the ones thrown into battle against Richard Johnson's division near Winfrey Field. Later in the afternoon, the two rebel brigades stepped off, and Walthall immediately came into contact with Johnson's troops. The well-fortified position of the Blue troops formed an impenetrable wall for the Mississippians. To the north, Govan's brigade advanced and found no enemy in their front. The 6th and 7th Arkansas did break off to engage some of the Union troops, but the rest passed by the flank. Baldwin and Willock were not oblivious to the rebels going past them. Willock suggested Baldwin move his reserve to the flank and hit the enemy with enfilading fire, which he did. The Federal troops harassed the Confederate flank, catching them off guard. This forced Govan to pull back. Walthall likewise pulled back when he realized he could make no headway against the Blue line. The fresh division of Patrick Cleburne was now in that sector, and Liddell was convinced that a great opportunity could be had if a fresh division attacked the Union line in that location. Cleburne knew Liddell very well. Liddell had served as a brigade commander under Cleburne for nearly a year, but Cleburne refused the offer to attack. Furthermore, it was getting dark, and the Irishman didn't know the ground in front of him. Lieutenant General D.H. Hill, Cleburne's corps commander, arrived on the field, and Liddell reiterated his argument to Hill, who concurred that an opportunity could be had. It was settled Cleburne would attack, despite the growing darkness. George Thomas was working diligently to piece the Union battle line together amid the breakthrough. After Govan and Walthall's failed attack, Thomas ordered Baird to place 2 of his brigades on the left of Johnson. At this point, Thomas made an important decision. The Union line was now disconnected, with its left too far to the east of the Lafayette Road. At 5 p.m., Thomas gave the Union left the order to fall back and concentrate on more commanding ground. When he gave that order, the breakthrough at Brotherton Field was still being fought off by the divisions of Van Cleve and Negley. However, the division commanders did not receive the order until after the breakthrough had been pushed back. Thomas personally rode to the Union left, convened with Baird and Johnson, and all 3 generals rode to the west in order to scout the best ground to place their men. All 3 generals were gone when Cleburne's men deployed for an attack. Darkness was covering the battlefield, and this led to great confusion for Cleburne's troops. Brigadier General Sam Wood's brigade started off confused. For one, Wood could not be found, and the regiments lost connection with one another in the darkness. When they stepped off, the 45th Alabama surged past its other comrades, while the others attempted to feel their way through the darkness. The 16th Alabama came up on the left of the 45th and fired a volley into their own comrades. The confusion led to both of those regiments falling back to the safety of the woods. The regiments that did make it to the Union lines exchanged volleys with one another, but because they simply aimed at muzzle blasts, neither side were very accurate. However, that would not be the case when Colonel Baldwin rode in front of his lines to urge his men to counterattack the rebels. Confederate bullets killed Baldwin and his horse. His troops tried in vain to recover his body, but to no avail. He was most likely buried in one of the unknown soldiers' graves. Cleburne ordered up 2 artillery batteries to fire into the Blue ranks from a distance of about 60 yards. This secured the center of Wood's disorganized brigade. Polk's brigade worked its way around the Union left flank, but because of the positioning of Scribner and Starkweather's brigades, the 2 Union brigades fired into one another while attempting to fight back against Polk's troops. Baird's men fell back in decent order despite the confusion. Cleburne's 3rd Brigade under Colonel Deschler had lost contact with Wood in the darkness and had traveled to the southwest. Cheatham, not knowing about this disconnect, ordered Smith and Jackson forward to support Deschler. Since Smith thought he was acting in a supporting role for Deschler, he didn't send out skirmishers. Riding at the front of his battle line, Smith found himself in the middle of Dodge's troops. About 30 rifles fired at the mounted figure, and some found their mark. Smith would be seriously wounded and die within the hour. Deschler's brigade did locate the correct location and swung north, overlapping Dodge's line and capturing a large number of the 77th Pennsylvania. With their flanks collapsing, Willock, Dodge, and Baldwin's men fell back and formed on Baird's division. Cleburne did not pursue. His division had pushed back the enemy, just as his superior wanted, and to push further might risk the integrity of his brigades. The entire day of September 19th had been a confusing situation. Union brigades were detached from their normal divisions and corps, and sent to various sectors depending on where the rebels attacked. By nightfall, Thomas Crittenden, commander of the 21st Corps, commanded the Union right, while George Thomas, commander of the 14th Corps, commanded the Union left. Alexander McCook, commander of the 20th Corps, had no discernible command. All of his divisions and brigades had been taken and placed either on the Union right or left, and therefore he was left without anyone specifically to command. The Confederate command was also in a confused state. 4 separate Confederate corps were on the field, but the rebels, like the Union, had plucked brigades and divisions from different sectors and threw them into battle alongside different units. Braxton Bragg decided to make 2 wings, with Leonidas Polk commanding the right and James Longstreet commanding the left. He met with each wing commander separately, telling them the battle plan of Polk assaulting the Union position at dawn with D.H. Hill's corps, breaking the line, and then moving south. Longstreet would then attack and help drive the Union Army away from Chattanooga. Bragg expected his wing commanders to inform their subordinates of the plan. Polk sent the orders to Hill and went to bed, expecting them to be delivered, but they never were. Hill positioned Cleburne's troops before riding off at midnight for Bragg's headquarters. Hill got lost and had to return to Cleburne's position, where Hill found out that he was now under Polk's command. It was now 3 a.m., and Hill set off again, searching for Polk this time. He never found him. Major General John Breckinridge was the other division commander in Hill's corps. Breckinridge spent much of the night at Polk's headquarters, but Polk never told him about the attack he was to make as a part of Hill's corps. Longstreet, on the other hand, after receiving orders from Bragg at about 11 p.m., went to bed, arose before dawn, and notified all of his division commanders of their responsibility for that day. The dawn attack that Bragg had planned was already going awry before it ever took place. On the morning of September 20th, Union Major General William S. Rosecrans was up and moving by 6 a.m., riding over his lines, making adjustments as he went. The night before, Major General George Thomas had pulled his troops back to a position he had scouted as Cleburne's division attacked his troops on the night of the 19th. On the Confederate side, troops were mostly inactive. Lieutenant General Leonidas Polk knew he needed to get his troops started to begin the dawn attack that Bragg had planned the previous day. He dispatched an aide to send messages directly to division commanders John C. Breckinridge and Patrick Cleburne, part of D.H. Hill's corps, bypassing the chain of command. The aide found Cleburne, Hill, and Breckinridge together, and Hill asked to see the message. The aide refused and instead gave it to Breckinridge and Cleburne, who immediately gave it to Hill. Hill's troops were already preparing breakfast, and Hill decided that the attack would have to wait. As the morning passed by, Lieutenant General James Longstreet, in preparation for his attack that would follow Polk's attack, shifted his troops. Knowing he didn't have enough time before Polk attacked to redeploy his troops, he simply shifted them. Longstreet wanted his best division, Hood's old division, now commanded by Evander Law, to lead the attack, so he ordered Alexander P. Stewart's division to move north so that Law could move into that position. But when Bushrod Johnson saw Stewart moving, he likewise moved north, forcing Law to position his division behind Johnson and Stewart's division partly moving in front of Cleburne's division. To add further weight to the attack, Longstreet moved the brigades of Joseph Kershaw and Benjamin Humphreys behind those divisions. It was a strong line, and years later, Longstreet would recall that the number of men and the peculiar formation of the force that I sent against the Federal line in this battle could have and would have carried any position except a strongly fortified one. George Thomas, still concerned about his left flank, and rightfully so because the Confederate forces planned to strike it hard, ordered Negley's division to his assistance, but before they could get to the flank, Rosecrans ordered him to return his troops to their original spot. However, Beatty's brigade did continue the march to Thomas and the Union left flank. On the Confederate side, Polk, Army Commander Braxton Bragg, and Hill argued the situation, with Bragg's subordinates offering a litany of excuses for not attacking. When Rosecrans found troops to take the place of Negley, he sent Negley's division to the aid of Thomas, but only after sufficient troops were found to take the place of Negley. The divisions of Wood, Davis, and Van Cleve moved into position on the west side of the Lafayette Road. It was now past 9 a.m., and the battle had not erupted. Beatty to the north was in the wrong place, according to Thomas. Thomas wanted him to extend his brigade to the Reed's Bridge Road near the McDonald farmhouse, not form across the Lafayette Road. Beatty did as he was told, but was greatly concerned because his lone brigade could not extend from the Union left to the home in a solid mass, but he did take solace in the fact that other members of his division were on the way. However, during this entire morning sequence of events, the Confederate divisions of Patrick Cleburne and John C. Breckinridge were maneuvering into position in preparation for an attack on the Union left. To disguise his weak front, Beatty sent out a double skirmish line to give the illusion that he possessed more men than he actually did. It didn't fool anyone. Both Breckinridge and Hill reconnoitered the ground and saw the weakness of the Federal flank. At 9:45 a.m., Breckinridge and Cleburne stepped off to launch their attack with Armstrong's cavalry on their right flank. The Confederate attack was too much for the thin line Beatty had put together, and the left flank crumbled under the weight of the rebels. The 104th Illinois and the 15th Kentucky on the right held together better and just withdrew a short distance. What helped them was the fact that Helm's Orphan Brigade approached the well-fortified and reinforced line of Absalom Baird's brigades. The 6th and 4th Kentucky and part of the 41st Alabama broke contact with Dodge's brigade and had moved to the west. The right of Breckinridge's line swept southward, attempting to get behind Thomas's line, just as Bragg had ordered. Helm's divided brigade made repeated assaults against the Union line defended by Scribner, King, and Dodge. The right maneuvered further to the west with the rest of the division. Helm himself would be hit in the side, mortally wounding the brother-in-law of First Lady of the United States, Mary Todd Lincoln. Members of various divisions began converging on Thomas's threatened line. Stanley's brigade of Negley's division arrived and deployed on the west side of the Lafayette Road, along with Colonel George Dick of Van Cleve's division. Colonel William Gross's brigade of Palmer's division advanced north up the Lafayette Road with orders to protect Baird's left flank. He barely got his brigade deployed when Breckinridge's brigades attacked. The rebels advanced on their front and on both flanks, threatening the rear of the brigade. Members of Gross's brigade recalled that the whole affair happened so quickly that they had no choice but to run. For the most part, Gross's command lost all cohesion, many of them withdrawing to the south to regroup and rest as much as they could. Breckinridge's soldiers continued their pursuit south, but fell into a trap. First Adams's brigade ran into a strong line formed by Stanley's brigade, and Adams himself was seriously wounded. To the east, Stovall's men became surrounded by Federal regiments, who turned about face and fired volleys into their front, flanks, and rear. The 3 regiments of Floridians, Georgians, and North Carolinians would be lucky to make it out alive. Stanley maneuvered the 19th Illinois to his right as the other 2 regiments engaged with the men from Louisiana. Randall Gibson took command of Adams's brigade. His men were getting tired, having fought for over an hour. When Stanley charged the beleaguered Confederates, the Louisianians couldn't withstand the bayonets from the blue troops and broke and ran to the safety of the McDonald farm, where artillery could cover their position. To the east, the 35th and 9th Ohio charged Stovall's men at the north end of Kelly Field, sending the rebels running for the safety of the woods. When Breckinridge saw Adams and Stovall's men streaming back through the woods, he ordered his men to fall back, knowing the attack had failed. While Breckinridge was attempting to outflank the Union Army from the north, Patrick Cleburne's division was attempting to join in the attack with the Kentuckian. Both men's divisions were part of D.H. Hill's corps and were supposed to attack together, but the shifting of troops and the pull of Helm's brigade northward led to great confusion on the battlefield. Cleburne's rightmost brigade, under command of Lucius Polk, was ordered to keep in contact with Helm's brigade, but Helm's shift to the right forced Polk to move his own brigade northward. Wood's brigade was supposed to stay on Polk's left, but the sudden change in arrangement drew his right 2 regiments into the engagement with Polk, leaving Wood's left without any support. Polk's regiments got battered as they attacked the entrenched Union position, so Cleburne rode to Wood, who was keeping his left stationary, and asked why he was not moving. Wood explained that the shift northward threatened his left flank because Alexander Stewart's division was in the way of Deschler's brigade. If Deschler couldn't move up, then Wood's left was unsupported. Cleburne ordered him forward with the promise that Wood would have support. Deschler couldn't move in the direction he was supposed to go in, so Cleburne decided to maneuver him to the north and fill in the gap between Polk and Wood, hoping that would stabilize his front. At the same time, Wood's regiments shifted to the left as the brigade advanced. To complicate matters more, Braxton Bragg got anxious when his dawn attack didn't materialize and broke the chain of command, having one of his staff members ride along the Confederate front, ordering each division in individually to attack. Stewart was the first to get the instructions. Not all of his brigades were ready, so he did as he was told and advanced Brown's brigade, one of the units ready for such an attack. They moved across Poe Field and came under heavy fire. At the same time, Wood's left regiment attacked. Both brigades would be thrown back. Bates' brigade was brought up by Stewart, but miscommunication resulted in Bate not assaulting the Federal line with Brown or Wood. Instead, Bates saw Wood's men falling back and advanced. Artillery and musketry ripped into Bates' line. Bate himself lost his third horse in the battle, one he had borrowed from the Eufaula artillery. Bate brought his troops back across Poe Field and into the safety of the tree line. So far, the Union brigades had one of the easiest fights they could remember. One of them described the fight as simple as loading and firing. The breastworks constructed by the Blue troops allowed them to load and fire in relative safety. The gap between Wood and Polk's brigades continued to drift further apart, but Cleburne was able to bring up Deschler's brigade. The Texans and Arkansans were to replace the two regiments of Wood's brigade, who lost contact with the rest of their sister regiments. Deschler attacked Turchin and Hazen's brigades, but the enemy were too well protected. Hazen reported only 13 casualties during the morning fight. Cleburne and Deschler brought the men back to the safety of a rise, but the two sides continued to throw lead at one another. As Deschler was encouraging his men, a 3-inch Federal ordnance shell ripped through his chest, killing him instantly and mangling his body. Colonel Roger Mills of the 10th Texas took his place. Mills hadn't the faintest idea of where the ammunition train was, so he ordered his men to take ammunition from the dead and wounded. When Cleburne saw the uselessness in keeping the brigade so close to the enemy, he brought them a safe distance to the rear to reform. Mills threw out a skirmish line of sharpshooters to harass the enemy while the rest of the brigade rested. To the north, Generals Hill, Walker, and Polk stood and argued about how and when to deploy William H.T. Walker's troops. Neither Hill nor Walker could agree, and Polk couldn't settle the matter, so the men gave up until word came that Breckinridge and Cleburne's attacks had failed. Only then did they agree that Walker's men needed to be sent in. Walthall's brigade attacked, but it only led to more casualties. Colquitt didn't reconnoiter the ground and came in with his flank to the Union troops. They swept the length of the Confederate brigade, mortally wounding Colquitt. Govan made a hard swing around the Union position, but the two halves of the brigade became separated in the process. Realizing the desperate situation they were in, being alone behind Union lines, they resolved to travel west to avoid Federal troops. Luckily for them, a member of Nathan Bedford Forrest's cavalry was with them who knew the way back. They then maneuvered back across the Lafayette Road. The attempt to support Breckinridge and Cleburne had been fruitless and late, but many Union brigades were being directed southward because of a crisis emerging on their right flank. The morning attack so far had revolved around George Thomas fending off Confederate attacks on the Union left flank. Naturally, he called for reinforcements from Rosecrans, which Rosecrans sent to him. Around 10:30 a.m., Captain Sanford Kellogg, Thomas's nephew and aide, rode to General Brannan and delivered instructions for him to move his division north. Brannan consulted with Joseph Reynolds, another division commander, and concluded that Reynolds could hold the ground alone, but that Brannan's move would expose his right flank, and they asked Kellogg to inform Rosecrans. Kellogg left, and Brannan and Reynolds changed their minds about leaving, but did not inform Kellogg or send an additional courier to relay the message. When Rosecrans heard about the gap that would emerge, he sent orders to General Thomas Wood to close up on Reynolds and support him. The order was confusing because the term close up on would mean to link his flank with Reynolds, but the word support would mean for him to get behind Reynolds. Wood was confused by the order because he didn't know that Brannan had been ordered away, so the order must mean for him to fall in behind Reynolds and Brannan. The Union commanders were mostly unaware of the significant repercussions of the movement. Buell was the most leery of moving out from his position. His 100th Illinois, without orders, advanced across the Lafayette Road and came face to face with the Confederate juggernaut. The sight and musketry led them to fall back to the Brotherton cabin. As they pulled back, the brigades of Barnes and Harker began making their way to the rear and north. The last to leave was Buell. He brought with him all but 2 companies of the 100th Illinois who remained near the cabin. On the Confederate side, Braxton Bragg had become anxious because his dawn attack had not materialized, so he instructed one of his staffers to order the divisions into battle, bypassing the chain of command. Except for Alexander P. Stewart's division, which got the order to move forward first, Longstreet held all of his divisions back until he gave the word. At around 11:15 a.m., Longstreet ordered in his divisions, one right behind the other. McNair's brigade ran up against the solid wall of blue formed by the brigade of Colonel John M. Connell. The other brigades found little to no resistance as they advanced across the Lafayette Road. Buell hadn't gotten too far when the Confederates advanced. To buy the rest of the brigade and artillery time, the 26th Ohio and 13th Michigan were turned to face the Gray troops. The day before, the 2 regiments had suffered dearly and were badly under strength. It took only a few minutes for the 2 Union regiments to collapse and head to the rear. As Confederate troops streamed across the Lafayette Road, Union commanders began trying to stall the advance. To the south, Alexander McCook ordered Jefferson C. Davis's understrength brigades into the fight to stop the Gray tide from advancing any further. The first Confederate troops they came into contact with was the Alabamians of Brigadier General Zechariah Dees. The sudden flash of musketry sent the Alabamians back to the road looking for cover. Unfortunately for Davis's men, their good luck would run out as more Confederates swept over their flanks. Part of Shug's brigade, the 7th Texas, 1st Tennessee Battalion, and 10th Tennessee, hit Martin's brigade in the flank. Seeing the support, Dees charged Carlin and Martin's brigades. Every Union regiment came under intense pressure from the charge. The 21st Illinois on the far right of Carlin's line began to buckle and then break under the pressure. It was the first in a chain reaction as the overwhelming numbers became too much for the battered Union regiments. The rest fell back as well. On the Union right, the Confederate brigades ordered forward by Longstreet were charging into the rear of the Union line. To the north, McNair kept assaulting Connell's troops to the west of Poe Field. Shug told McNair to hold his position and he would swing around to the Union flank. Shug's attack completely surprised the Federal troops, caving in the 17th Ohio, who began to run through the Union lines that lay in reserve. Some of Samuel Beatty's regiments turned to counter the Confederate strike, but held out for only a few moments, but they were able to save some artillery pieces, while others fell into Confederate hands. McNair and Shug pushed westward, not concerning themselves with the Union force to the north. Their orders were to press up behind the Confederate brigades in their front and offer support. When Benning's brigade marched just south of Colonel John Croxton's brigade, the Georgian became concerned for his and the attacking party's right flank. Benning swung his brigade northward, facing the 4th and 10th Kentucky of Croxton's brigade, which Croxton dispatched from their support role. The Georgians advanced past the burning Poe house and through some breastworks that had caught on fire. Benning's horse was shot out from under him. Around that same time, Croxton went down with a leg wound. Colonel William Hayes of the 10th Kentucky would take command of the brigade during the brutal close-range fight, with both sides throwing lead into one another's ranks. Hayes could look southwest and see another brigade of Confederates approaching his flank, so he ordered the brigade to fall back, but word did not spread to the 74th and 10th Indiana, who still fronted the Lafayette Road. The Confederate brigade approaching the flank was the Texas Brigade under Jerome Robertson. When the Hoosiers saw the Kentuckians leave, they charged south, stunning the Georgians. The Confederate brigade was sent back in great confusion. Benning, mounted on a stray artillery horse, rode up to Longstreet and exclaimed to the commander that "I am ruined. My brigade was suddenly attacked and every man killed. Not one is to be found. Please give me orders where I can do some fighting." Longstreet responded, "Nonsense, General. You are not so badly hurt. Look about you. I know you will find at least one man, and with him on his feet, report your brigade to me, and you too shall have a place in the fighting line." Further north, as the Union line was crumbling in that direction, General Reynolds attempted to shore up his line by turning Turchin and Edward King's regiments to face the Confederate threat to the south. Harker's brigade halted Robertson's Texans for the moment, giving the Union troops around Kelly Field a rest. Reynolds, not knowing his front was somewhat void of active Confederate regiments, wanted to buy himself some time in order to reconfigure his regiments, so he ordered the 105th Ohio to charge, The regiment passed through Poe Field, over the dead and wounded of the Confederate attacks in that area. Then they scraped by Benning's Georgians, moving through Brotherton Field. Reynolds thought the entire regiment completely destroyed until he found them at Rossville the next day, having maneuvered through the Confederate brigades of Longstreet's attack without encountering any stiff resistance. Longstreet's attack had shattered the Union line, resulting in Union division and brigade commanders attempting to hold what ground they could. The move by Wood's division was nearly lethal to the Army of the Cumberland, but many brigades and divisions were holding their ground as the gray tide swept over the battlefield. While the brigades in Law, McLaws, and Johnson's divisions were pushing west, the brigades of Thomas Hindman's division were at the southern end of the Confederate line. They routed 2 brigades under Jefferson C. Davis and were continuing westward. On the Union side, 20th Corps Commander Alexander McCook grasped at any Union troops in his area to throw against the approaching rebels. He found Colonel Bernard Leiboldt's brigade of Sheridan's division. They were already formed up, ready to receive the approaching rebels, but McCook wanted them to move out and attack the enemy. Leibold protested until McCook personally ordered him forward. Not knowing how close the enemy was, Leibold formed his brigade into column of regiments in order to march to the enemy. When he found the enemy closer than anticipated, he asked McCook for time to properly deploy his regiments, but McCook told him to go forward as he was. That turned out to be a costly mistake, as Zachariah D's brigade swarmed up around the flanks of the column of Federal regiments, hitting them from 3 sides. The 73rd Illinois got off a few rounds of ammunition, but many were unable to fire a single shot before they were forced to run back over the rise from which they came. Captain Mark Prescott of Battery C of the 1st Illinois Artillery was in a predicament. He was ordered to support Leiboldt's brigade, but now with them streaming through his guns, he had no further orders. He couldn't see the brigade of Brigadier General William Little approach it. Prescott became concerned over the safety of his artillery pieces, which could easily fall in the Confederate hands if D's rebels were again successful against this new Union line. The 36th and 88th Illinois engaged with D's line and fell back, only to be relieved by the 21st Michigan and 24th Wisconsin. Those 2 regiments engaged with D's brigade, and a hot firefight ensued, as D's men resolved to stand and fight rather than charge. They had pushed away 2 Union lines, driving them about half a mile, and were exhausted. The men from Illinois formed to the left of the Badgers, and for 20 minutes the 2 sides fired into one another's ranks. As more Confederate brigades made it to the field, more Union brigades did likewise, placed personally by McCook and Philip Sheridan, who oversaw this area of the battlefield. When Colonel Luther Bradley was wounded, Colonel Nathan Walworth took command of his brigade and led it to the critical area. On the far right of the Union line was the brigade under Colonel John T. Wilder, known as Wilder's Lightning Brigade. Behind D's brigade came a lone regiment, the 15th Alabama, led by Colonel William C. Oates. The Alabamians just a few months earlier had attacked Strong Vincent's brigade at Little Round Top. Now the 15th had become separated from the rest of their brigade during the assault, and were drawn to that area of the battlefield by the sounds of combat. Oates led his men around the right flank of D's brigade, but before his men could clear the flank, some of his companies unloaded a volley into the backs of their fellow Alabamians. The 2 sides engaged in a desperate fight, but Little's brigade was suffering greatly. The 36th and 88th Illinois began to buckle under the weight of the Confederate assault. Little, mounted on his horse, attempted to rally the men who were beginning to run. A bullet entered his back, and an aide rode beside of him to keep him upright. Still conscious, Little attempted to hold his brigade together until a bullet smashed into his teeth and exited through his neck. Mortally wounded, he asked to be left on the field to die. The brigade collapsed, but Walworth's right held on, doggedly fighting back against the Mississippians of Patton Anderson. Anderson's Mississippi brigade was fresh and contained around 2,000 men. With his left exposed because of Little's retreat, Walworth ordered his own withdrawal. Hindman ordered his men to halt. Although they had successfully routed 3 lines of Union soldiers, they had incurred a great many casualties and were exhausted. The only Union forces in the area now were under Wilder, who was holding back part of Anderson's brigade and all of Manigault's line with their Spencer repeating rifles. Manigault's Alabamians fled, and Wilder's men charged after them. The men from Alabama found Trigg's brigade near Vineyard Field, but Trigg did not engage with Wilder's men. At this point, Wilder concocted a plan. He wanted to push north and hit the Confederates in the flank, hopefully rolling up the Confederate line until he could make it to Kelly Field and George Thomas's line. However, this plan didn't get implemented. According to Wilder, because he had pushed deeper into Confederate lines, He formed his brigade into a square, with the artillery in the center to protect his brigade from all sides. The Assistant Secretary of War, Charles Dana, had been sent by the War Department to act as a representative in the Army of the Cumberland. Ultimately, he was acting as a sort of spy for the Lincoln administration, who did not have much faith in Rosecrans. Dana was wandering the battlefield. The Confederate attack had separated him from all other Union forces. He found Wilder at this point in the battle. According to Wilder, he was ordered by Dana to act as an escort for himself back to Chattanooga. Dana had no authority on the battlefield, but Wilder was unsure of Dana's authority. The Lightning Brigade would pull back and link up with troops from Sheridan's brigades to secure Missionary Ridge to the west and round up stragglers. Colonel Oates of the 15th Alabama found Colonel Little and brought him under a shade tree to die in peace. Although Hindman's troops were halted for the moment, other Confederate brigades were moving north. George Thomas was the highest-ranking Union officer on the field, and he was cobbling together a defensive line on Horseshoe Ridge that would give him the nickname, the Rock of Chickamauga. As Hindman dealt with Sheridan's division to the south, Longstreet's center division under Bushrod Johnson marched into Dyer Field, where 26 Union artillery pieces sat on the western edge of the field. Major John Mendenhall positioned these artillery pieces as directed by Major General Thomas Crittenden. The major gathered what cannons he could, as many of them were of no use in the dense woods that covered the battlefield. Two regiments, the 13th Michigan and 26th Ohio, neither of them numbering more than 100 men, assembled in the field to protect the artillery pieces. Confederate Major General John Bell Hood directed Johnson to capture the artillery pieces. When the Southerners exited the tree line, they came under a heavy bombardment from 26 artillery pieces. One of the shells wounded McNair, and Colonel David Coleman took command of the brigade. Battery E of the 9th Georgia Artillery Battalion unlimbered only one gun before the Union shells drove them back into the tree line. Perry's brigade had come up on Coleman's right flank to give support, but only contained 3 regiments. The 44th Alabama had departed the brigade near Poe Field, and the 15th Alabama was coming up behind Zachariah Dee's brigade and had accidentally delivered a volley of friendly fire into Dee's men. The Gray lines advanced across the field, with Coleman's brigade suffering extensive damage from the Union gunners. At one point, the entire brigade halted and sought cover along a fence line. Shook's brigade swung around the flank of the 8th Indiana Battery, which somewhat lightened the rounds of ammunition plunging into Coleman's troops. The 13th Michigan and 26th Ohio miraculously held out for a good 15 minutes against the overwhelming numbers of Confederates before they and many of the batteries withdrew from the field. In all, 14 or over half of the artillery pieces assembled by Mendenhall had been captured. Fulton's brigade to the south routed not only Union troops but Rosecrans himself, who had his field headquarters directly in their path. With the enemy gone, the Confederate brigades lost cohesion. Coleman's brigade pulled back across Dyer Field. The rest of Johnson's brigades advanced across it, taking up a position on the high ground beyond. Perry's men were without direction and sat at the north end of the field. Benning's Georgians were falling back from their engagement with the Federal forces near Poe Field. Robertson's brigade was advancing north, trying to find someone to support them in an attack against the gathering Yankees in their front, and Kershaw and Humphrey's brigades, searching for an enemy to fight, swung north through the Dyer Field. Many of the Gray troops were low or out of ammunition. Some solved the problem by discovering abandoned ammunition wagons left by the retreating Federals, but the men were exhausted. To the north, Jerome Robertson's brigade of Texans and Arkansans were attempting to dislodge a pocket of Federal resistance. They advanced across the open field, coming under an incredible barrage of enemy cannon fire and musketry from a thrown-together group of blue soldiers. To add to their woes, Robertson's troops were hit by friendly fire as well on their left flank. Their brand-new uniforms, which looked more blue than gray, had gotten the attention of some of their fellow Southerners. What Robertson didn't know was that he was in a foot race. Union General Thomas Wood, whose division opened the hole through which Longstreet's men entered the Union lines, ordered Harker's men forward without delay and without waiting to dress ranks. The 125th Ohio reached the fence that bordered the north end of the field and quickly began tearing it down to create a crude breastwork to hide behind. Then the rest of Harker's regiments filed in alongside the 125th. The Texans got stubborn as they traded volleys with the Federal troops out in the open. Then Wood ordered the 64th and 125th Ohio to advance, which they did in a continuous wall of volleys as the men used the same tactics as August Willock had done the day before against Cheatham's division. The Texans and Arkansans melted away amidst the iron and lead. A sergeant in Robertson's command remembered Dyer Field as the meanest, most unsatisfactory place I struck during the whole war. Men were staggering and stumbling to the rear, covered in blood, some swearing and some calling on God to protect them in their blind endeavor to find shelter from the storm of iron hail. It made me feel like the world was coming to an end then and there. Confederate Major General John Bell Hood, acting commander of Longstreet's corps during this day at Chickamauga, since Longstreet commanded the entire left wing of the Confederate Army of Tennessee, had just ordered Kershaw's brigade to support Robertson when he saw his Texans and Arkansans streaming back into the tree line south of the field. Hood rode amongst his men that he had led into battle as a colonel when a bullet entered his upper right thigh, breaking his femur. He tumbled from his saddle into the arms of his Texans. Without Hood to help organize, the Confederate offensive lost even more cohesion in the coming hours. Meanwhile, Kershaw's men with Humphreys' brigade close behind advanced northward, joined by the 1st Arkansas Mounted Rifles, who had gotten lost from Coleman's brigade. Adding to Harker's woes was the removal of some of the artillery on his right and the 21st Ohio. Union Division Commander James Negley despaired over the Union's situation and began pulling out artillery and infantry that he could find and retreat toward Rossville. The 21st Ohio fell back to Horseshoe Ridge, and the Union forces gathered there by George Thomas. Thomas was riding back and forth across Kelly Field from his main line to Horseshoe Ridge and Snodgrass Hill. When he, Wood, and Harker saw Kershaw's men, they were puzzled about what to do. Their uniforms looked blue, and they didn't recognize the flags. They carried Army of Northern Virginia battle flags, not the Polk or Hardy Corps flags that the Army of the Cumberland was used to. Even after a volley by the strange troops, Thomas was uncertain. He thought it may be Sheridan's troops, who he had been expecting for the last hour. He instructed Harker to wave his flags as hard as possible to let the brigade know they were Federal forces. The new uniforms issued to Kershaw's men allowed the South Carolinians to advance within 100 yards of Harker's line and fire a volley. Now there was no mistaking, this was the enemy, and Harker's men fired back. The South Carolinians surrounded Harker's men. Kershaw's plan to overlap the Union position was working, and when confronted by the 2nd South Carolina and 3rd South Carolina Battalion on their right, the 58th Indiana and 100th Illinois broke first. This created a domino effect, with the 125th Ohio being the last to hold out, backing away slowly and making the Southerners fight for every inch of ground. The regiments would eventually reform near the Snodgrass cabin. The Union now had thousands of soldiers positioned on Horseshoe Ridge, assembled there by George Thomas, Thomas Wood, and others, as various regiments and brigades retreated to the northwest. Taking this high ground would be one of the most difficult endeavors by the Confederate forces under Longstreet's command during this battle. Union Major General George Thomas held out when so many other Union generals had retreated back toward Chattanooga. His original line east of Kelly Field was still holding steady, and the cobbled-together line on Horseshoe Ridge, made up of what regiments Thomas and others could convince to continue the fight, was about to be tested by the oncoming rebels. Kershaw's victory against Harker's brigade resulted in the South Carolina regiments becoming disorganized. Kershaw's men scrambled up the ridge. The 2nd South Carolina on the left got a destructive fire from the 21st Ohio, who, with their 5-shot Colt revolving rifles, were able to hold their own against the previously successful rebels. None of Kershaw's troops made any headway against the blue line and had to either fall back or be recalled by their commander. They remained at the base of the ridge, skirmishing with the Federals, but waiting for more support in order to launch another attack. Humphreys' brigade came up on Kershaw's right, but only advanced a short distance. Humphreys had taken over from William Barksdale, who lost his life at Gettysburg, and that battle had mangled the brigade. After encountering a few Federals, Humphreys halted and fell back, not informing Kershaw of the movement. Humphreys told Longstreet that he believed the Federal position too strong to attack at that location, and Longstreet agreed, but this still left Kershaw without any support or knowledge about who may come to his aid. Longstreet found Bushrod Johnson and ordered him north with the intention of swinging around the Union right flank on Horseshoe Ridge. The wandering regiment that was the 15th Alabama, commanded by William C. Oates, wandered behind Kershaw's brigade and took up a position between the 3rd and 7th South Carolina. The desperate situation began to draw Federal troops to the stand on Horseshoe Ridge. When Thomas peered through his field glasses to the north, he could see troops moving in his direction. If they were Confederates, his entire line was doomed. Nervously, he asked another officer to look through his field glasses to see if they could confirm the troops' identity. They were indeed Union soldiers, 2 brigades under Walter Whitaker and John Mitchell from Gordon Granger's Reserve Corps. They were led to Horseshoe Ridge by their division commander James Steedman and Granger. The relieved Thomas was thrilled to see them and another brigade, that under Ferdinand Vanderveer, who left his position in Kelly Field to support Thomas on Horseshoe Ridge. Thomas positioned Steedman's troops on the right flank and Vanderveer in Snodgrass Field. Oates and his 15th Alabama began to confuse matters within Kershaw's brigade. Oates decided to attack but wanted the regiments on his right and left to go with him, so he rode over to the 3rd South Carolina and asked the colonel for its support. The colonel refused, so Oates ordered him to attack. South Carolinian outranked Oates by date and ignored the order. Next, Oates went to the right to the 7th South Carolina, which was commanded by a captain. When Oates ordered him to attack with his regiment, he ignored the Alabamian because Kershaw had personally placed the regiment at that location and would not move until ordered by Kershaw. Oates now simply addressed the companies of the 7th, shaming them into joining him. A few companies stepped forward, which triggered the rest to join Oates in the attack. The 2 regiments moved up the ridge. Kershaw heard the noise coming from his right. He was expecting Humphreys to attack and thought the musketry was the Mississippians, so he ordered the left of the brigade into the action. Neither the 8th nor the 15th South Carolina joined the attack, and it fizzled out, costing Kershaw valuable manpower. One of the soldiers killed was Sergeant Richard Kirkland, known as the Angel of Mary's Heights for his humanitarian actions giving water and aid to wounded enemy soldiers at the Battle of Fredericksburg. His dying words were, "Tell my pa I died right." Kershaw's brigade fell back to safety, but Oates' Alabamians became pinned down on the hillside. It was about that time that Kershaw learned about Humphreys' lack of aggression, which undoubtedly disgusted the South Carolinian. Help was on the way for the Confederates, however. Bushrod Johnson with the brigades of Fulton and Shug, and supported by Anderson's brigade of Mississippians, passed by Kershaw, attempting to find and turn the Union right flank. George Thomas initially wanted to send Granger's forces under General Steedman to fill the gap between Horseshoe Ridge and Kelly Field, but when he learned about Johnson's Confederates coming up on his right, he sent the fresh troops to that sector, and not a moment too soon. Whitaker's brigade slammed into the Confederates as they were coming up the hill, protecting the 21st Ohio's right flank that was nearly being turned by Anderson's troops. As Whitaker's men pushed forward, Mitchell's brigade joined alongside them, throwing back the gray attackers. General Steedman rode in amongst the ranks, rallying men who may have wanted to turn back and encouraging the actions of those brave men who stayed. A fall from his horse left him hatless and bloody, but he continued to stay on the front lines. Fear and death may come for the general at any moment, and Aide asked him for any last words. Steedman stated, "Make sure they spell my name right." Whitaker's front line was so successful that they advanced too far out front, and a heavy fire sent the men running for the rear. As the Confederate left was falling back, Kershaw had been reorganizing his brigade to support this new assault. But as the South Carolinians moved up Horseshoe Ridge, they passed by the brigades they thought they were to support. This assault by part of Kershaw's brigade yielded no results, mostly because additional reinforcements from Vanderveer's brigade added more weight to the Union line. The 7th South Carolina did plant their colors on the breastworks of the Union position, but the minor breach was sealed and the Confederate brigade headed for the rear. Johnson on the left got more troops as Dees and Manigault's brigades of Heineman's division came up to support the Confederate assaults. Johnson threw the brigades into action against Mitchell and Whitaker's brigades, but the attacks were met with difficult terrain and not properly deployed, which resulted in the Union forces throwing back each piecemeal attack launched by the Gray troops. It was now about 4 p.m. and both sides were exhausted, especially those units defending and attacking Horseshoe Ridge. Lieutenant General James Longstreet held William Preston's division of Simon Bolivar Buckner's corps in reserve and decided to throw it into the action since the attacks on Horseshoe Ridge had stalled out. A brief meeting with Bragg indicated to Longstreet that the commanding general thought the battle lost, but Longstreet knew the blue troops were on the run. On the Union side, Thomas got word from General Rosecrans when the Army commander dispatched General James Garfield back to the battlefield to reassess the situation. Knowing that the rest of the Army was rallying near Chattanooga, Thomas felt better about the overall situation. William B. Hazen's brigade near Kelly Field would come up to Thomas's aid on Horseshoe Ridge as the fighting reignited on the hillsides. Gracie's brigade of Preston's Confederate division made it to the field and formed behind Kershaw's line. Preston was bringing up Kelly's brigade to extend Gracie's left flank, but before he could, Gracie's brigade stepped off toward Horseshoe Ridge. Kershaw, claiming he was attempting to organize the multiple brigades on the front line, had ordered in Gracie, much to the dismay and anger of Preston. On Gracie's left, Anderson's Mississippians blocked the 43rd Alabama, and instead of moving through them, Gracie ordered the 43rd to fall in behind the rest of the brigade in a support and roll. On the left side of Gracie's attack, the brigade became pinned down, and his right melted away from the withering fire from the Union rifled muskets. Kelly's brigade on the far left began their swing to hit the Union forces, but confusion reigned throughout the brigade when the 58th North Carolina came into contact with Federal regiments. Kelly, believing he had stumbled into part of Gracie's line, ordered the Tar Heels to stop firing. Before the regimental colonel could order them to continue their volleys, the lead flying through the air sent the North Carolinians and the 63rd Virginia tumbling down the hill. The 5th Kentucky continued on up the hill, and when the 21st Ohio fell back because of a lack of ammunition, the Kentuckians finally gained a foothold on Horseshoe Ridge, something no Confederate regiment had been able to do in the horrible attacks thus far. Gracie once again tried to conquer Horseshoe Ridge. He ordered the 43rd Alabama, the unit he helped organize, up the slopes of the ridge. The 1st and 2nd Alabama Battalion, part of Hilliard's Legion, followed, and now another foothold on the ridge was gained by the Confederate attackers. The 1st Florida Dismounted Cavalry, lost from its brigade, came up on Gracie's right, and Gracie placed them as support for his line. Success on the Confederate left came when Johnson renewed his attack, which drove the Federals away from their fortified position. The blue troops had little choice. They were out of ammunition, so many resolved to fall back a safe distance and fix bayonets. The situation was becoming too dangerous to stay. Thomas had made up his mind to pull back from Horseshoe Ridge and withdraw to Rossville. Most of the Union regiments fell back, but a misunderstanding resulted in a few remaining on the ridge, particularly the 89th Ohio, 22nd Michigan, and 21st Ohio, who were acting as a rear guard. Gracie's men, out of ammunition, pulled back as well to reorganize the regiments. The growing darkness and heavy smoke that now covered the battlefield concealed the movements of the brigades of Kelly and Trigg as they descended upon the 3 regiments left atop Horseshoe Ridge. The Federals had no choice but to surrender. Other than those regiments, most of Thomas's troops on Horseshoe Ridge had gotten away. Now it was time for the men still remaining in Kelly Field to withdraw. George Thomas's strong line around Kelly Field had remained virtually unmoved. Repeated Confederate attacks had stalled out, but the blue troops around Kelly Field could hear the battle raging in their rear on Horseshoe Ridge. Now Union forces were withdrawing from Horseshoe Ridge. It must have come with some relief when George Thomas returned to Kelly Field from Horseshoe Ridge and began to tell his division commanders how the withdrawal back to Chattanooga would proceed. From south to north, each division would begin marching north toward McFarland Gap. Confederate commanders in this sector had resolved to use long-range firing and skirmishing to harass the Union line. This type of fighting resulted in little damage, but it did kill Edward King, and his brigade would be taken over by Milton Robinson. With Union troops caving in on Horseshoe Ridge, Longstreet urged the division of Alexander P. Stewart to begin a movement against Kelly Field at about the same time as Thomas planned the withdrawal. Reynolds' 2 brigades would move out first, making their way up the Lafayette Road. It would be their job to clear out the McDonald Farm, which was swarming with Confederate regiments, to provide a safe route toward Chattanooga. Next was the brigades of Gross and Cruft, but as they pulled away, the Confederate brigades in their front began to move toward the position. John K. Jackson's brigade made contact with Scribner's Union brigade. Close behind was the brigade under Lucius Polk from Cleburne's division. When Stewart's division moved forward, Clayton's brigade found abandoned breastworks from Reynolds' men, so they moved ever so cautiously, at first unaware of the removal of Union troops. Turchin and Robinson smashed into the flank of St. John Liddell's division on McDonald Farm, taking them completely by surprise. Once they had cleared out Walthall and Govan's brigades, they formed on the right of McCook's brigade, acting as a rear guard for the rest of the brigades to make it to McFarland Gap. When it was Starkweather's turn to withdraw, Polk's brigade was already attacking his front. In that instant, he believed it would be more dangerous to withdraw than stay and fight, but then he thought if the rest of the army was withdrawing, he would be left on the field and subject to complete capture. so he began to fall back as more rebel brigades closed in on their position. The added pressure by the Confederate brigades caused the rest of the Union troops to pull back to avoid complete and total capture. The withdrawal around Kelly Field resulted in a close call for the Federals, but they had made it out of their predicament without any major damage. By the morning of September 21st, the Army of the Cumberland fortified Rossville Gap and positioned troops along Missionary Ridge. If Bragg did advance and attack, it would result in a bloody endeavor. Nathan Bedford Forrest climbed to the top of Missionary Ridge, then climbed a tree to get a better view and reported to Bragg that the whole Union Army was in retreat. He was wrong, however. What he saw was Union wagon trains and wounded moving toward Chattanooga, but he failed to mention the mass of Federal troops on Missionary Ridge guarding the city. Bragg eventually dispatched Polk's wing of the army north to the Red House Bridge, but the movement of the Army of Tennessee was slow because of a lack of wagons. The reinforcements from Virginia, East Tennessee, and Mississippi made the army even larger, and many of those units had come by rail, foregoing their wagons, so Bragg would have to rely on railroads to supply his troops. By the end of the day on the 21st, Rosecrans' army filed into the former Confederate entrenchments around Chattanooga. Various Union infantry and cavalry guarded pivotal locations along Missionary Ridge. Eventually, those troops would be driven in by Confederate cavalry. Bragg's infantry would follow, with Longstreet moving through Rossville Gap and Polk's men traversing Missionary Ridge. The battle had been deadly for both sides, resulting in the second bloodiest battle of the Civil War, second only to Gettysburg. The Union lost 1,657 killed, 9,756 wounded, and 4,757 missing and captured, for a total of 16,170. The Confederacy lost 2,312 killed, 14,674 wounded, and 1,468 missing or captured, for a total of 18,454. The battle ruined the career of William S. Rosecrans, who would be replaced by George Thomas. The Confederate Corps commanders would come together in an effort to oust Braxton Bragg from Army Command, but come up unsuccessful. Nevertheless, Bragg would be facing not just a new Army commander in Thomas, but he would soon come face to face with the man who had been winning victories for the Union in the West, Ulysses S. Grant. For the next few months, the Army of the Cumberland and the Army of Tennessee would face off in siege warfare around Chattanooga. Through the end of September and into October, the Confederate Army of Tennessee under Braxton Bragg had laid siege to the Union Army of the Cumberland commanded by George Thomas, entrenched in and around the city of Chattanooga. The Confederate forces had done a good job of cutting off most of the food from going in and out of the city, but small amounts of men and food could make it into Chattanooga. One of those men who entered the Union lines on the night of October 23rd was Ulysses S. Grant. When he arrived at headquarters, Thomas and General William Baldy Smith greeted him. Days before, Smith put forward a plan to break the siege by capturing Brown's Ferry. Many people ridiculed the plan, but Thomas believed it one of the better options and told Smith to make preparations by assembling pontoons, boats, and bridging material. As Grant lounged by a warm fire, Smith outlined his plan to the high-ranking officers of the Army. Grant agreed to the plan. The next day, Thomas, Smith, and Grant visited Brown's Ferry to examine the ground over which the troops were expected to assault the Confederate forces on the other side of the Tennessee River. The opportunity was now, since Union General Joseph Hooker, with troops from the Army of the Potomac, was on their way to their assistance from Bridgeport, Alabama. If Thomas and Grant could secure Lookout Valley, they could open up a steady supply line to the city and give them a foothold to dislodge the Confederates off of Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge. For the assignment of capturing Brown's Ferry, 2 brigades were chosen. William B. Hazen's brigade would lead and spearhead the assault. Hazen's actions at both Stones River and Chickamauga won him and his men exceptional praise. At Stones River, they held out in the Round Forest and allowed Thomas and then Army Commander William S. Rosecrans to assemble a defensive line on the Nashville Pike. At Chickamauga, they doggedly held out against Confederate attacks, again buying the Union High Command time to put together a stronger defensive line. Hazen would be joined by Ivan Turchin and his brigade. Turchin immigrated to the U.S. from Russia, where he served as an officer in the Russian army during the Crimean War, as well as participated in other military operations. Turchin's performance at Chickamauga won him great praise as he became part of Thomas's strong line at Kelly Field. Part of Hazen's brigade would float down the river on boats, while the rest of the brigade and all of Turchin's men would cross Moccasin Point to Brown's Ferry. Once Hazen's force occupied the hills on the west bank of the river, Turchin's men would cross the river on a pontoon bridge. As Turchin, Hazen, Smith, and Thomas prepared for their operation to take Brown's Ferry, Confederate commanders made it much easier for them to do so. Evander Law's brigade of Alabamians guarded Lookout Valley and Brown's Ferry. Law, a good friend of Confederate General John Bell Hood, who was wounded at Chickamauga, took leave in order to visit his injured friend. During his absence, Micah Jenkins pulled most of Law's troops away from Brown's Ferry and Lookout Valley and sent them to the east side of Lookout Mountain for apparently no reason. When Law returned to his command, he was astonished to find his force absent from Lookout Valley, aside from the 15th Alabama. Smith planned for 2 Union brigades to move out around 3 a.m. on the morning of October 27th. However, they did run into some problems. One boat was entirely too small to fit the men from the 23rd Kentucky, so the remaining men had to find their way onto the boats of other regiments. The Kentucky squad would be led by James Foy, and they would spearhead the operation. The next boats would be occupied by the 41st Ohio, led by Colonel Wiley, and the last of the vessels would be filled with men from the 93rd Ohio, commanded by Major William Birch. The rest of the brigade, including the 1st Ohio, would be led by Lieutenant Colonel E.B. Langdon and would cross by land over Moccasin Point. Before dawn, the squadrons of Hazen's brigade would load onto the boats and then proceed down the Tennessee River. They could see the fires from the Union pickets, and they kept quiet, not uttering a word, especially so when they passed into Confederate-held parts of the river. Campfires indicated the locations of the Confederate pickets. The boats were so crammed that many men had to simply stand with their rifled muskets to allow for all of them to remain in the boat. As they floated along the bend of the river, a man in the lead boat let out a yell, and then a splash was heard. The boat had passed too close to the bank, and a tree limb had knocked him into the river. The poor soldier was rescued by a boat of soldiers behind his own, unhurt but cold from his dip in the river. The Confederate pickets paid the sound no mind. The blue troops huddled close to one another to withstand the cold as they floated down the river. Foy's boat carrying the 23rd Kentucky passed up the signal fire that indicated where they were to dock on the west bank. Hazen had to call out for him to maneuver his boat, which he did, but this signaled to the Alabamians waiting on the riverbank that Union soldiers were crossing the river. Foy's men pushed up the bank of the river, driving the Confederate pickets. The only regiment in the valley was the 15th Alabama under William C. Oates and part of the 4th Alabama. The sound of fighting informed Oates that the Federal soldiers were massing in his front, so he organized his men and sent them to a rise that overlooked Brown's Ferry. Some well-placed volleys sent Foy's Kentuckians back to the ferry, but the 41st Ohio and 93rd Ohio were already making their way to the top of the hill surrounding the ferry. Oates now realized that he didn't have enough troops to combat the crossing, and the pontoons were already being laid for the bridge. Additionally, Oates was now suffering from a leg wound, where the bullet hit him in the thigh, fracturing the bone just below the hip joint. Oates met Law on the withdrawal and told him that the Yankees couldn't be pushed back with his own small force and that it was too late. Law rode to a rise and observed the bridge being built and the blue troops fortifying the hills, and knew that Oates was correct. He positioned his troops to guard the roads and informed his commander James Longstreet of the event. Longstreet paid it no mind. He believed the attack was a diversion to disguise the movement of Union troops south of their position that he believed would attack him on top of Lookout Mountain. Braxton Bragg was more concerned over the Brown's Ferry engagement than Longstreet, and ordered Longstreet to push that Union contingent back, but Longstreet didn't follow orders. Meanwhile, on the Union side at Brown's Ferry, Hazen was exceedingly proud of his men. To show his appreciation, he issued each man 2 extra ears of corn in his rations. A veteran of Hazen's brigade recalled the event years later at a reunion and said, "2 ears of corn as a reward of bravery may seem like a joke to you companions, as you sit around this well-filled table tonight, but I assure you that on the occasion referred to, had the option of a Medal of Honor or 2 ears of corn been given to the troops, very few would have accepted the medal." Bragg and Longstreet met atop Lookout Mountain at Sunset Rock and discussed what to be done about the foothold gained at Brown's Ferry. However, a more serious matter was materializing in Lookout Valley. Joseph Hooker was arriving with the 11th Corps and part of the 12th Corps from the Army of the Potomac. The 11th Corps troops approached Brown's Ferry and encamped for the night. Hazen was concerned that Hooker hadn't prepared his men for an attack that the Federal officers expected as a counter to the capture of Brown's Ferry. Hooker placed Brigadier General John W. Geary's division near Wauhatchie to guard the supply route through Lookout Valley and the station located there. The isolated division caught the eye of Longstreet, and instead of attacking Brown's Ferry, Longstreet intended to attack Geary's lone division, which was under strength at the moment. Bragg told Longstreet that he could use the division of W.H.T. Walker and that he would even send Breckinridge's troops to help in throwing back the Union forces, but Longstreet decided to attack with a single division, that under Micah Jenkins. Law's brigade was already in the valley, so he would move Jerome Robertson's Texas Brigade, Henry Bidding's Georgians, and John Bratton's South Carolina Brigade, formerly Jenkins' Brigade, into the valley. Law and Robertson would occupy some hills in the valley and attack Hooker's force if they came to the rescue of Geary's division, which would be attacked by Bratton's force. Benning's men would occupy a position on the left of Law and Robertson to give support to Bratton if needed. All of this was to occur in a night attack. The 29th Pennsylvania acted as skirmishers for Geary's division. The Pennsylvanians formed a perimeter around their comrades so that any advance by the enemy would be detected and give them enough time to react. At around midnight, Bratton's troops marched down Brown's Ferry Road and pushed the skirmishers back toward the Union division. The heavy firing convinced Geary to send the 111th Pennsylvania up the road. The men from the Keystone State faced east, anticipating an attack from the direction of Lookout Mountain, but Geary quickly realized that the main attack was coming from the north and reoriented them as the 109th Pennsylvania fell in beside their sister regiment. Bratton's South Carolinians descended upon the lone Union division, and heavy fighting broke out in the darkness. Brigadier General George S. Greene, the savior of Culp's Hill on the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg, received a horrible wound as the engagement began when a bullet shattered his jaw and tore out part of his right cheek. He was immediately taken to the rear. The Union artillery on a hill south of the 111th and 109th Pennsylvania wreaked havoc on the Gray troops until the Southerners began to target the cannoneers. Among the casualties was Geary's son, who commanded a section of the battery. The Confederate bullets eliminated nearly half of the artillerymen, which raised the anxiety level of the crewmen. The next series of Union shells hit in amongst Union soldiers, decapitating a member of the 111th Pennsylvania and tearing off the leg muscles of another. Bratton sent the Palmetto sharpshooters and Hampton's Legion to the flanks of the Union division. Members of the Legion captured a wagon train as they traversed the road in their front, but the scared teams of mules ran into their lines, causing a great disorder. The 137th New York arrived on the scene to throw back the rebels, but Bratton wasn't done yet. The darkness and casualties didn't stop the brigade commander from thinking one final charge would spell doom for the Federals. Geary's men were running low on ammunition and began to fix bayonets and brace themselves for hand-to-hand combat if the rebels came again. Before he could launch another assault, word came to Jenkins to pull back. All of the commotion from the Battle of Wauhatchie got the attention of Hooker, who panicked, thinking that Geary's lone division would be completely destroyed. He hurriedly got his divisions in motion. Although Hooker intended for Carl Schurtz's division to take the lead as they marched to Wauhatchie, Brigadier General Adolph von Steinwehr's division started for Geary first, with Orlando Smith's brigade in the lead. This mix-up would lead to Geary receiving no help. About a mile outside of their camp, along the Browns Ferry Road, shots rang out from a wooded hill and bullets ripped into the 73rd Ohio as they marched in their columns of fours. The volley came from Law's skirmishers, placed at the bottom of the hill. Smith deployed his 3 regiments, with the 73rd Ohio on the right and the 33rd Massachusetts on the left. The 136th New York stayed in reserve near the road. The surprising volleys from what would become known as Smith's Hill worried Hooker, who now thought that the attack on Geary might be a diversion to allow the Confederates to retake Brown's Ferry. He immediately ordered Smith to attack the hill and for Steinwehr to use his other brigade under Adolphus Buschbeck in support. Hooker didn't know that Steinwehr was in the lead, so he thought Schurz was already on his way to relieve Geary, when in fact Schurz was still behind Steinwehr. Law had put together a strong line on top of Smith Hill. He used his own brigade and that of Jerome Robertson to cover the hill and protect his own line of retreat in the event of his position being overrun. When the Federals pushed up the hill, the forest, darkness, and elevation caused the regiments to lose contact with one another. The Alabamians and Texans unleashed horrendous volleys into the blue ranks, with the 33rd Massachusetts taking the brunt of the volleys. The 73rd Ohio and the 33rd Massachusetts fell back into the field at the base of the hill. Meanwhile, the entire march to help Geary was falling apart. Shorts led Tyndale's brigade toward Wauhatchie, but some stray bullets from Smith's Hill hit one of his aides, convincing him to stop. But with orders to press toward Geary, he resumed the march. Behind him was Colonel Schinovsky, who stopped in the road, hearing the heavy guns from atop Smith's Hill. Colonel Hecker was behind Schinovsky. Hecker decided to go around Schinovsky by moving off the road and through a field to the west. However, one of Oliver Otis Howard's aides stopped him and ordered him to front Smith's Hill and give support to Smith. Shorts and Tyndale's brigade was stopped by another aide and told to prepare to assault a rise just to the south of Smith's Hill, a location that would become known as Tyndale's Hill. After the unsuccessful attack by Smith's regiments, Law moved the 4th Texas to his extreme right. At the same time, Smith moved the 136th New York to the Bay Staters' left. As the Federals attacked for the second time, a gap emerged in the Confederate line between the 15th Alabama and the 44th Alabama. This allowed for the men from Massachusetts to gain a foothold on the hill, but they still didn't have the reinforcements to break the Gray Line. Law was inundated with reports that Federals were sweeping along the river to his right, and reports that Bratton's attack on Geary had failed. The latter was true. Seeing the situation too hazardous to hold out against the growing number of Federals, Law withdrew his troops, allowing Smith's men to capture the hill. Captain William Richardson of the 15th Alabama lost contact with his troops in the confusion and stumbled into the Union lines. Not recognizing them as the enemy, he said, "Well, boys, that was a devil of a fright we got a while ago." A Federal soldier put his hand on the captain's shoulders and informed him he was a prisoner. The shocked captain pleaded with the blue soldiers, saying, "Look here, gentlemen, I am most egregiously mistaken. I thought this was the 15th Alabama. By heavens, this ought not to count." Meanwhile, the 4th Texas didn't receive the order to withdraw. The 136th New York and 33rd Massachusetts hit them in front and flank, driving the Texans from the hill. To the south, Benning's Georgians held Tyndale's Hill, but when Bratton's troops made it to safety, they pulled back too, allowing Tyndale to capture the hill with the loss of only a single man. Longstreet's attack was over, and it had been entirely unsuccessful in its mission. In fact, the defeat of Longstreet and the withdrawal of Confederate troops from Lookout Valley secured the supply line to Chattanooga. That line would be known famously as the Cracker Line because of all the hardtack crackers that passed over it. Both sides lost a little over 400 men in the darkness of October 28th and into the 29th. It would be an ill-fated domino in a string of losses for the Confederacy that would allow Grant and the ever-increasing Union troops under his command to secure Chattanooga for the Union. After the failure to dislodge Joseph Hooker's Union troops from Lookout Valley, Confederate General James Longstreet brought his troops to Lookout Mountain and the valley between that eminence and Missionary Ridge. The bitter rivalry between Longstreet and Army of Tennessee Commander Braxton Bragg worsened, and Bragg hoped to get rid of Longstreet by dispatching him toward Knoxville to deal with Union General Ambrose Burnside, who had captured that city in early September. Bragg made the decision and Longstreet left with 2 of his divisions for Knoxville in early November. By mid-November, another obstacle for the Confederate Army arrived in Chattanooga, Union Major General William Tecumseh Sherman. Ulysses S. Grant welcomed Sherman into his headquarters, and Grant, Sherman, and Commander of the Army of the Cumberland, George Thomas, discussed the upcoming plans for dislodging the Confederates from their positions on Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge. Union General Oliver Otis Howard was in the room as well with the 3 men and wrote, "I had the opportunity of hearing the proposed campaign discussed as never before. Sherman spoke quickly but evinced much previous knowledge and thought. Grant said that Sherman was accustomed to bone his campaigns, i.e. study them hard from morning till night. General Thomas furnished them with the ammunition of knowledge, positive and abundant, of the surrounding regions of East Tennessee and northern Georgia. General Grant appeared to listen with pleasant interest, and now and then made a pointed remark. Thomas was like the solid judge, confident and fixed in his knowledge of law, Sherman like the brilliant advocate, and Grant rendering his verdicts like an intelligent jury. Sherman was bringing with him the Army of the Tennessee, the trusted army of Ulysses S. Grant that allowed him to capture Vicksburg. When the whole army would arrive, parts or all of 3 Union armies would be arrayed against the lone Confederate Army of Tennessee. Thomas and Grant differed on how to dislodge the Confederates. Thomas favored attacking Lookout Mountain first, while Grant wanted to attack the north end of Missionary Ridge. The reason for Grant's insistence on attacking Missionary Ridge was because of Burnside's occupation of Knoxville and the knowledge that Longstreet was on his way to attack said commander. If Grant could push Bragg south and break his communications with Longstreet, then Burnside could be much safer. This also might force Longstreet to withdraw from East Tennessee. On the Confederate side, Longstreet asked Bragg for more troops to deal with Burnside, and Bragg relented. He would send 2 divisions to assist Longstreet, one under Patrick Cleburne and the other under Bushrod Johnson. Bragg indeed saw Sherman's troops crossing Moccasin Point and disappear into the hills north of the city, but he misjudged their objective. He thought that Grant was sending Sherman to attack Longstreet, not attack his own force at Missionary Ridge. This miscalculation further weakened Bragg's force as Cleburne and Johnson pulled back toward Chickamauga Station to begin boarding trains for Knoxville. This movement of Confederate troops off of Missionary Ridge set in motion a series of events that would result in Grant defeating the Confederate Army occupying the heights overlooking Chattanooga. When Patrick Cleburne's troops evacuated their entrenchments on Missionary Ridge, Union officers in Thomas Wood's division watched them leave their post. Grant became flooded with reports that the Confederates were leaving. Rebel deserters who sought shelter in the Union lines also brought news of a withdrawal. Grant was unconvinced but deeply interested if that was the case. He ordered Wood to conduct a reconnaissance mission in his front. 4 Union divisions formed up to perform this mission, around 14,000 men. Wood placed Brigadier General August Willock on the left, Hazen on his right, and put Samuel Beatty's brigade in reserve. To Wood's right, Philip Sheridan's division arrayed his brigades, with George Wagner's brigade on the left, Charles Harker's brigade on the right, and Francis Sherman's brigade in reserve. To the left of Wood's division was the divisions of Carl Schurz and Adolph von Steinwehr from Oliver Otis Howard's 11th Corps. Wood's objective was the hill to his front known as Orchard Knob. 2 of Arthur Manigault's Confederate regiments picketed Orchard Knob and the area to its south. At 1:30 p.m., Wood and Sheridan's men stepped off. The 24th Alabama, who occupied Orchard Knob, fired a few volleys into Willock's men, but as the blue troops neared, they ran over the knob, and Willock occupied it, with a loss of only 4 men killed and 10 wounded. Hazen to the south had a much more difficult time pushing back the enemy in his front. The 28th Alabama decided to stay and fight it out. What resulted was a quick but bloody engagement. Hazen's 93rd Ohio lost 12 killed and 45 wounded. The 41st Ohio lost 60 men total before they took the position. Sheridan encountered little resistance in his front and took the position fairly easily. Wood sent word to Thomas that he had captured Orchard Knob and asked for further orders. Thomas wouldn't order them back because they had gained significant ground and felt that having them fall back after such an accomplishment would be bad for morale, so he ordered him to dig in. Wood then placed Samuel Beatty's brigade to the left of Willock to secure Orchard Knob for the Union. At 3:30 p.m., Thomas ordered Howard's troops forward, but neither division pushed the enemy in their front. Their advance ground to a halt when they encountered the Confederate pickets. Watching as many of the regiments in the 11th Corps hid behind objects and refused to go any further, Wood dispatched Beatty, who cleared out the pickets from the front of Steinwehr and Short's men. Beatty then returned to Orchard Knob, but the 11th Corps didn't take advantage of the open ground that he had cleared of Confederate skirmishers, and the Gray troops regained the ground in front of the 11th Corps. The Confederate High Command sat atop Missionary Ridge trying to figure out what to do next. Near dusk, Confederate artillery opened on the divisions of Wood and Sheridan. An Illinois soldier wrote to his sister that the dusky form of the mountain encircling our position for 3 miles seemed in the dim twilight like some dense thundercloud looming against the heavens and shooting forth unceasing flames of lightning, while its thunder made the earth tremble beneath our feet and innumerable shells fell, bursting above and around our lines. Despite the grand spectacle, the artillery did little damage to the blue lines. November 24th was the date Grant wanted Sherman to attack the right flank of Bragg's army on Missionary Ridge. Hooker on the far right was to demonstrate against Lookout Mountain and take the position if possible, but it was mostly to be a diversion so Sherman could operate effectively against the Confederate right. Pontoons and bridging material, as well as a steamboat, would transport Sherman's troops across the Tennessee River. All of his troops were expected to cross by 7 a.m. However, delays resulted in Sherman's troops not getting across until afternoon. Meanwhile, Bragg did little to improve his lines atop the ridge or Lookout Mountain. Cleburne's division was recalled from Chickamauga Station and remained behind Missionary Ridge awaiting orders. While Sherman transported his troops across the river, Hooker prepared his men to demonstrate against Lookout Mountain. The word demonstrate was used by Grant, but Hooker planned to seize the mountain to win glory for himself. General Geary and his division, supported by Whitaker's brigade, arrayed themselves on the side of Lookout Mountain. Standing in their way was the brigades of Walthall and Moore from Cheatham's division. From the base of Lookout Mountain, Hooker dispatched Gross's brigade to the junction of a road that ran in front of the mountain and the railroad. Walthall's Mississippians occupied that location with a skirmish line, which held off Gross's men. When Walthall sent the 34th Mississippi to support the brigade's skirmishers, Hooker called off Gross's attack. He then ordered Wood's brigade of Osterhaus's division to shift to the right and for Gross to take the rest of his brigade to the right and act as support for Wood's. As Geary's men swung around Lookout Mountain, they came into contact with Walthall's front line of Mississippians. The first line of defense was no match for the overwhelming numbers of the Federals attacking their front, and they quickly left their position headed for the rear. But as Geary's men kept marching, some of them with fixed bayonets, they hit Walthall's second line. The blue troops were encouraged by the ease of the first line breaking that they thought this one would do likewise. The Union brigades were thrown back in their first attempt to take the area around the Craven's house. However, Cobham's regiments on the right was able to flank the 27th Mississippi. The commander of the 24th Mississippi was told by Walthall to hold the line until hell froze over, and he took that order seriously, holding his line together despite the rapid advance and overwhelming numbers of the Federals. When the situation appeared too dire for his men to stay, he stated the ice was 5 feet over hell and his men fell back in great disorder. While Walthall battled with Geary's division, Moore and his brigade wondered whether he should enter the fight or not. The Acton Division commander, known as Mudwall Jackson for his lackluster performances, was non-committal. With the firing growing louder in his front, Moore moved his men toward the Craven's house and delivered a volley. The Union troops were somewhat protected by a stone wall and some other features, but their exhaustion and Confederate bullets convinced them to fall back in response to this group of Southern reinforcements. However, Geary's front line was receiving support as well. Whitaker, inebriated as usual during battle, was coming up behind the front line. Because their commander was drunk, the regimental commanders took matters into their own hands. The 40th Ohio moved forward to engage Moore's men. Other regiments followed behind them, despite Whitaker wanting them to stop. However, Moore's men were holding on to their position. One soldier of the 37th Alabama remembered Lieutenant Thomas Carlisle's calm demeanor during the fight. Lieutenant Carlisle was rushing here and there among the men, with sword in right hand and pipe in the left. For a moment he would stop, take a pull or two at his pipe, then renew it, and shout at his men to stand firm. A little later, when the pipe had been exhausted, we saw him deliberately dust out the ashes and replace the pipe in his pocket and again rally the men, all the time just as cool and apparently unconcerned as if out for a picnic frolic when men were falling about him. Whitaker at this point was able to act in a positive way when he sent his supporting regiments to the far right flank of his front line. There they hit Moore's men in the flank. Taking heavy casualties from the enfilading fire, the men from Alabama fell back in great haste, securing the ledge of Lookout Mountain for the Union. It was now after 2 p.m., and Hooker's men didn't move any further. The thick fog that characterized the fight all day had amazingly grown thicker, and to push forward may result in discovery of entrenched Confederates. As the fighting died down on Lookout Mountain, Sherman and his forces were attacking the north end of Missionary Ridge. The normally aggressive Sherman became cautious as he finally ordered 3 of his divisions forward against the northernmost point of Missionary Ridge. Confederate Corps Commander William Hardee saw the movement and immediately sent word for Cleburne to come up. It would be a race for the heights, but Cleburne would get there first and began deploying his troops. Sherman moved his men up the heights, but the waning daylight and the fact that he misunderstood the topography forced Sherman to halt his advance, and the blue troops began to dig in. The next day would bring another battle as Union forces sought to rid themselves of the Army of Tennessee watching them from the heights around Chattanooga. During the night of November 24th, the defeated Confederate forces that sat atop Lookout Mountain made their way down the Summertown Road into Chattanooga Valley and across Chattanooga Creek. A lunar eclipse shielded their movement from Union soldiers' eyes, but the darkness made the trip off the mountain more treacherous. One soldier described the scene. As quietly as possible, but with stiffened limbs, they went stumbling and falling and rolling down those rough declines, cold and chilled to the bone. Getting into column as best they could, they passed across the valley and Chattanooga Creek. The men, wet and cold, and tired and hungry, were disheartened, and incapacity had turned victories into defeats. It was expected that similar lines would be followed, and they were not in good humor. The moon went into an eclipse and shrouded everything in almost total darkness, which to many was an omen of evil. It was a sad moment for the troops and an enraging one for their army commander Braxton Bragg. Bragg was astonished that Carter Stevenson, who commanded the mountain, couldn't hold such an impregnable location. At a council of war, Bragg, William Hardee, and John C. Breckinridge met to discuss what to do next. Their forces were pulling back to Missionary Ridge, the last defensive location still under their control around Chattanooga. Hardee suggested that the army pull back to Chickamauga Station and maybe even further into Georgia in order to find a defensive position that gave them a better advantage. Breckinridge recoiled at such a suggestion. He argued that Missionary Ridge was a great defensive location and that if the soldiers couldn't fight there, they couldn't fight anywhere. Bragg sided with Breckinridge but agreed with Hardee that Sherman would renew his attack against the northern end of Missionary Ridge and for Hardee to reinforce that area. On the north end of the ridge, Patrick Cleburne, who skirmished with Sherman that evening, grew restless, wanting to know what was to happen the next day, so he sent an aide to find Hardee. The aide found the corps commander and Hardee stated, "Tell Cleburne we are to fight, that his division will undoubtedly be heavily attacked, and that he must do his very best." Cleburne and his division had become one of the most dependable units in the Confederacy, and Hardee had faith in the Irishman. Not all soldiers were confident. A member of Cleburne's division wrote, "Their minds were filled with doubt and their hearts burdened with misgivings. They had seen nothing but blunders and defeats, and expected nothing else today. They knew they would fight only with the strength left from the shipwreck of their hopes, that they were standing on the embers of their ruined edifice, and with this knowledge the eclipse produced an effect that was unaccountable were it not for the gloom that paralyzed their hope. They discussed the situation, the loss of Lookout Mountain, the foothold the enemy had obtained on our right, of Hooker to follow from Lookout Mountain and envelop our left, and no force to stop him, of the opportunity thrown away to capture Chattanooga and destroy the Federal Army, and the infatuation that determined a general engagement with the risk of ruin to the army. They were in a poor state of mind to loan any confidence to General Bragg. He had expressed a want of confidence in the army, and they returned the want of it in him with interest." Ulysses S. Grant, commanding all Union forces in and around Chattanooga, hoped that William T. Sherman's dawn attack on the 25th of November would roll up the flank of Bragg's army. On Lookout Mountain, soldiers under Joseph Hooker's command planted a United States flag on the summit, signaling to all that Lookout Mountain was entirely in Federal hands. George Thomas ordered Hooker to move toward Rossville Gap in preparation to hit the left flank of the Confederates on Missionary Ridge. Grant wanted Thomas to ascend Missionary Ridge from the east when Sherman turned the Confederate flank, but the hours were passing by and Sherman wasn't moving. Aside from a few sporadic volleys, Sherman hadn't fully engaged the Confederates at Tunnel Hill. Sherman decided to attack with only 2 brigades from Hugh Ewing's division, putting the rest of his men in a supporting role. A much larger attack could have been made. He had over 16,000 men. At dawn, he approached Ewing, his brother-in-law, and said, "I guess, Ewing, if you're ready, you might as well go ahead." He puffed on his cigar and then added, "Keep up formation till you get to the foot of the hill." Ewing then asked, "And shall we keep it after that?" Sherman responded, "If you like, if you can, but don't call for help until you actually need it." Corse's brigade would attack the Confederates at Tunnel Hill, and Loomis's brigade would approach the hill from the northwest. That morning, Ewing told Loomis not to bring on a general engagement. The morning was passing away, and those precious hours that Sherman waited allowed Cleburne to reinforce his position. It was a much stronger line than the night before. Now, at nearly 8 a.m., Sherman rode over to the left of his line and ordered Joseph Lightburn to dispatch 200 men to support Corse's left flank. Lightburn chose the 30th Ohio and part of the 4th West Virginia for this task. The Ohioans and West Virginians stepped off toward the Confederate position, unaware that Corse's brigade hadn't begun their assault. They came into contact with skirmishers from the 24th Texas. The exchange of volleys from the two sides convinced the Texans that they needed to fall back, but as they did, the commander of the Ohioans ordered an advance, so the Texans performed a fight and withdrawal. Stopping to catch their breath, the 30th Ohio could see the rebel artillery perched on the top of the rise in front of them. Eager to capture the artillery, they dashed up the ridge. Once they got within range, the cannons fired canister into their ranks, dismantling the unit. They fell back to a safe position with their commander, Colonel Theodore Jones, irate that Corse was nowhere to be found. Jones sent word back to Lockburn that he needed support. He sent the 37th Ohio to Jones's left, but at the same time, Corse's regiments began to file to Jones's right. The 40th Illinois attacked the Confederate position, but they received no support, either from Jones or from their own brigade. As they fell back, the 46th Ohio, along with Corse himself, came up. At first, he expressed confidence that an attack with his and the 30th and the 37th Ohio on his left, they could break the Confederate line. However, he quickly changed his mind and asked Jones to report back to Sherman and ask what they should do next. When Jones reported to Sherman, Sherman snapped back, "Go back and make that charge immediately. Time is everything. If you want more men, I will give you that. General Grant is on Orchard Knob, waiting for your assault in order to send up a column from the Army of the Cumberland." While Sherman grew angry and lashed out at Jones, Cleburne received reinforcements. Lewis's Orphan Brigade and parts of Brown and Cummings' Brigade filed on to Cleburne's left. The buildup of troops in that sector reflected Bragg's concern over his right flank. Hardee and Bragg both left Cleburne to manage the area, having great faith in the Irishman. Following Sherman's orders, Corse, with Lockburn's regiments on his left, charged the rebel position. The undulating terrain tired the Federals, but they got to within 50 feet of the earthworks before a combination of musketry and canister drove the Federals back, with the Texans chasing after them. As the 40th Illinois and the 46th Ohio hunkered down in a ravine, they stopped the Texans in their tracks, wounding Brigadier General James A. Smith of Cleburne's brigade of Texans. Cleburne would replace Smith with Hiram Granberry, and the Texans returned to their breastworks. Corse, now becoming agitated, ordered the 103rd Illinois and the 6th Iowa to charge the rebel works. They made it into the rebel lines where hand-to-hand fighting broke out. All of the officers in Sweat's batteries supporting the Texans were gunned down. Cleburne sent the 2nd and 5th Kentucky from Lewis's brigade to dislodge the Federals from his right flank. It was now past 11:30 a.m., and Corse's brigade and part of Lockburn's brigade had fought for over 3 hours and hadn't dislodged Cleburne's men. Corse and his men would fall back, with Corse being wounded in the attack. Command of the brigade would go to Charles Walcutt. Walcutt asked Sherman for reinforcements, but Sherman was done with the northern approach to Missionary Ridge, thinking it useless to attempt another assault, so he ordered Walcutt to hold his position. It was noon and Sherman would try another approach. Loomis's brigade hadn't made it any further than the railroad embankment by this point. The long-range fire from the Confederates on top of Tunnel Hill and the rebel skirmishers at the bottom held them in place. Loomis had been given permission to call upon Bushbeck if he needed additional help. When he asked for reinforcements, Bushbeck sent the 27th and 73rd Pennsylvania regiments to Loomis's left and helped to drive back the rebel skirmishers. At this point, Colonel Joseph Taft, who commanded the two regiments, ordered a halt, but the 27th continued on up the hill, clawing their way to the top. Within 30 yards of the Confederate position, they stopped and began to fire on the rebels. They drove some of the artillery away. The Confederate infantry would have to expose their heads too much to return fire, so they started to lob rocks down the hill, striking many Federal soldiers, wounding them. Cleburne's line was growing even stronger as the 34th Georgia and more artillery batteries occupied the hills and knolls on the north end of Missionary Ridge. Loomis grew even more anxious about the precariousness of his line and went to his superiors asking for help. Brigadier General Charles Matthews and his brigade stood behind Loomis, ready for action, but wouldn't take orders from Loomis. Loomis then went to his division commander, Ewing, and Ewing told him to order Matthews forward under his orders. Loomis did as he was told, and Matthews' men advanced across the fields leading to Tunnel Hill. Confederate artillery watched their every move and lobbed shells at them the entire distance. When they made it to the elevated terrain, they halted, being partly protected from the artillery fire and musketry at their current location. A member of Matthews' brigade recalled the assault. In front of us was a rail fence, and, being in direct line of fire, its splinters and fragments flew in every direction. "Jump the fence, men, tear it down," cried the colonel. Never did men get over a fence more quickly. Our distance was nearly half a mile to the rebel position. We started on a charge, running across the open fields. I had heard the roaring of heavy battle before, but never such a shrieking of cannonballs and bursting shells as met us on that charge. We could see the enemy working their guns, while in plain view other batteries galloped up, unlimbered, and let loose at us. Behind us, our own batteries were firing at the enemy over our heads, till the storm and roar became horrible. It sounded as if the end of the world had come. Halfway over, we had to leap a ditch, perhaps 6 feet wide and nearly as many deep. Some of our regiment fell into this ditch and could not get out. A few tumbled in intentionally and stayed there. I saw this and ran back and ordered them to get out, called them cowards, threatened them with my revolver. They did not move. Again I hurried on with the line. All the officers were screaming at the top of their voices. I too screamed, trying to make the men hear. "Steady, bear to the right, keep in line, don't fire, was yelled till all were hoarse, until the awful thunder of the cannon made all commands unheard and useless. The remains of 2 Union brigades, Matthews and Bushbeck, clung to the side of the ridge. To venture back across the fields meant sure destruction. But most of Bushbeck's men had ran out of ammunition. The commander of the 73rd Pennsylvania sent runners to the rear 3 times for more ammunition, but none returned. Colonel Taft, who had led the regiment, decided to go back himself to get ammunition, but as soon as he stood up, he was cut down by a rebel bullet. It was much safer to stay. The 27th Pennsylvania asked for help from Matthews, who sent the 26th Missouri and the 93rd Illinois up the hill to support them. At the same time, Claiborne had sent the 2nd and 15th Arkansas consolidated to counter the Union advance. Sherman, Ewing, and others now were becoming greatly concerned over the situation, and Grant on Orchard Knob was growing tired of Sherman's lack of success. Colonel Greenberry Rom was ordered to the right of the Union line. The disposition of his troops would be up to him. The rebel artillery overshot his columns of men as they marched to the aid of their fellow blue soldiers. At the base of Tunnel Hill, Rom put the 80th Ohio on the left and the 17th Iowa on the right, with the 10th Missouri and the 56th Illinois held in reserve. Then the front line was moved up the hill to support Matthews. Most of Claiborne's men, especially the Texans, were out of ammunition, and something had to be done about the 2 new Union regiments approaching the rebel breastworks if Claiborne's line was to hold. More regiments came to Claiborne's aid, the 36th and 56th Georgia, as well as the 1st and 27th Tennessee Consolidated Regiment. Claiborne and many of the Confederate officers began to wager that a strong counterattack down the hill would stop the Federal assaults. The Georgians, Tennesseans, and Texans charged off the hill, rounding up countless amounts of prisoners. As they charged down the hill, Rom's reserve line still remained at the base. The 2 sides threw about 4 or 5 volleys into one another, and then the Confederate regiments slowly made their way back up Tunnel Hill. The Union brigades would be pulled back to safety, and Sherman's attempt to outflank Bragg on Missionary Ridge had failed, stopped by Claiborne's men. Ulysses S. Grant became incredibly frustrated at William T. Sherman's failure to capture the north end of Missionary Ridge at Tunnel Hill. Now, Grant knew that to relieve the pressure in front of Sherman, he needed to make an advance against the Confederate center on Missionary Ridge. The Southerners' position looked intimidating at first glance, but in reality it was poorly equipped to sustain such a massive assault that Grant had planned. Braxton Bragg and John C. Breckinridge believed that a head-on assault by Union forces at their crest was not likely, and instead strengthened their flanks, believing the only serious attacks would come from there. Thus, the fortifications in the Confederate center were sporadic and ill-equipped. Not until the night of the 23rd of November did Breckinridge direct that work begin on strengthening the rifle pits and breastworks for an impending attack. He also directed Patton Anderson to remove half of his division from their positions at the foot of the ridge to the crest, further weakening the lower fortifications. The rebels on the crest faced the disadvantage of being placed too close to the top of the ridge, which meant that they would be silhouetted against the sky to the attacking blue troops. Furthermore, rebel artillery on top would have trouble firing on approaching Federals because they could not depress their barrels enough to shoot accurately at the forces in the valley below. For the 2 days leading up to the battle on the 25th, troops changed positions, ultimately weakening the foot of the ridge, and the Army of Tennessee simply did not have the capability to devise such intricate fortifications that were needed. General Manigault complained that details were made to construct breastworks. Some 40 entrenching tools were furnished for this purpose, but were taken away by superior authority, after having had the use of them for 2 or 3 hours. There were but 4 axes in the command. The consequence was that the work progressed slowly, and the protection obtained against the enemy's fire in this new line was poor and insufficient. In the valley between Chattanooga and Missionary Ridge, the Confederates had created a beautiful field of fire. They denuded the valley to have a clear view of the enemy as they approached, for keeping them warm and for building fortifications. It was now after 3 p.m., Grant and George Thomas again discussed a movement against the ridge with Thomas's Army of the Cumberland, but Thomas wasn't willing to agree to such a movement with this small force against such an impregnable-looking position. Grant walked away. After his aide John Rawlins shamed him into ordering Thomas to move, Grant then gave the official order to Thomas to take the entrenchments at the base of the ridge to relieve the pressure on Sherman. Thomas and Gordon Granger, one of Thomas's corps commanders, discussed the matter further, then parted ways. Minutes passed and no Union soldiers were moving. Grant inquired as to why they weren't advancing. Thomas said that Granger was directed to move the men forward, but Granger was helping to aim and fire an artillery piece close by. Grant snapped at Granger, saying, "If you will leave the battery to its captain and take command of your corps, it will be better for all of us." With that scolding, Granger set his attack in motion. Union soldiers started coming out of their entrenchments, collecting their stacked arms and adjusting their equipment. As the battle lines formed, the blue troops knew that the leaf-bare woods would provide them with a little shelter from the lead and iron raining down on them, but upon exiting the woods, each brigade either had 300 to 700 yards to march through the denuded valley before reaching the rebel lines, dependent on their placement. It took roughly an hour for the thousands of troops to form up. Each regimental commander received the orders for attacking the ridge. Commander of Company B of the 124th Ohio remembered, "No emotion was visible in the soldierly face of our brave colonel, save perhaps a little more violent chewing of a large quid of the weed that added rotundity to his bronzed, weather-beaten cheek." His further order was that we inform each man in the ranks of what was expected of him. Commanding at the time Company B, it was my painful duty to break the news to those that I had known from boyhood, that I had learned to love as brothers. No one that I communicated the order to but turned pale. Now there was nothing to do but wait. Now the time hung heavy. Now the soldier's thoughts were filled with home and loved ones left behind, and what would become of them if he should fall on the terrific charge that he knew would soon have to be made. It is the dreadful waiting that is more terrible than the shock of battle. Grant had ordered Thomas's men at the sound of 6 guns fired in rapid succession from Fort Wood to assault and take the rifle pits and halt. However, his orders were horribly misunderstood by many commanders, wondering what to do after they halted in the rifle pits. General Absalom Baird, upon hearing the order, asked, "And when we have captured the rifle pits, what then?" The answer came, "I have given you the order in the exact words of General Grant." Not having received clarification, Baird sent his orders to his brigade commanders, who passed it down to regimental and company commanders. Confusion was running rampant in the Union battle line. General August Willock, a former soldier in the Prussian army, claimed the only order he received was to advance. A major under Willock reportedly asked him where they were to stop, and Willock replied, "I don't know. At hell, I expect." General Philip Sheridan was also confused by the order. He wrote, "While riding from right to left and closely examining the first line of pits occupied by the enemy, which seemed as though they would prove untenable after being carried, the doubt arose in my mind as to whether I had properly understood the original order, and I dispatched Captain Ransom of my staff to ascertain from General Granger whether it was the first line that was to be carried or the ridge. He had scarcely left me when the signal was given, and the division marched to the front." It was about 4 p.m. and Thomas's troops were ready. The ground ahead of them looked ominous as Missionary Ridge leered over them, and the Confederates could be seen bristling the top. When those 6 guns belched forth their signal for Thomas's men to advance, 23,000 Union troops stepped off, aimed at Missionary Ridge. Worry set in on all Southern soldiers from the rank and file to commanders that Missionary Ridge could not be held against such an immense attack. The valley seemed to be an ocean with the Federal battle lines appearing as waves. A few rebels in the ranks lost their nerve and slipped out of their trenches. One soldier who deserted claimed he was willing to fight the Yankees 2 to our 1, but when he heard old Grant command "Attention world, by nations, right and left wheel," he thought it was about time for him to retire. A massive cannonade erupted from Missionary Ridge as Confederate artillery sent iron at the blue lines, but the hail of iron did little damage to the approaching Federals. Many of their rounds exploded too high in the air for them to have any effect on the enemy. The cannoneers simply couldn't depress the barrels low enough. Grant had ordered the men not to fire during the advance, making the Northerners quicken their pace. Just prior to the Union stepping off, Bragg, scared of a gap between Tyler and Tucker's brigades, ordered Reynolds' brigade to the top of the ridge. This movement was made as the Union approached. However, Reynolds' brigade's position at the base did not match the position at the crest, and his men moved through Tyler's brigade, causing confusion through the ranks. When Reynolds did settle into his correct spot, He only had a portion of his brigade. The others were still trying to extricate themselves from the entangled battle lines to his left. This left a huge gap at the base of the ridge. Confederates in the lower rifle pits were unable to make sense of what was happening. Breckinridge had ordered them to fire one volley and then proceed up the ridge to the crest. However, that order failed to reach most regiments and companies. Therefore, the ones who had not received the order and stood and fought, it looked like their comrades around them were retreating. The Floridians on the rebel left are a great example of those who didn't receive the order and stood their ground until the skirmishing fire became too great and they laid down in the rifle pits. Some, like Robert Watson of the 7th Florida, skedaddled up the slope to the crest safety. He remembered the hill was dreadful steep, and the enemy kept up a continual fire and threw a continual shower of bullets among us, and I only wonder that they did not kill all of us. Many a poor fellow fell exhausted and was taken prisoner. I stopped several times and took a shot at the Yankees, and at the same time it rested me. The bullets flew around us so thick that it seemed impossible to escape unhurt. A bullet struck my knapsack at the right shoulder and came out at the left shoulder, making 23 holes in my blanket. When I reached the top of the ridge, I was so much exhausted that I fell down and lay there for several minutes to recover breath. Due to the terrain, the various Union brigades reached the rifle pits at different times, still cohesive in many respects. When they reached the rifle pits, they encountered empty fortifications or light resistance, because the majority of Southerners began to retreat. Some artillery pieces were able to get a range on the blue troops and threw rounds into the new occupants of the rifle pits. Union commanders, one by one, upon reaching the base, ordered their men forward to the crest because it was too dangerous to stay put. It was an arduous journey up the steep slope. Grant at Orchard Knob saw his lines moving past the rifle pits and began interrogating both Thomas and Gordon Granger as to who ordered them up the ridge. Both men denied having given the order, and Grant fumed. What happened next was a result of slow communication and overall miscommunication. Sheridan, who had dispatched Captain Ransom to ask Granger whether it was the first line or the crest he was supposed to take, got an answer. Ransom came back saying it was the first. Sheridan interpreted that as his men needed to fall back. However, his men were already engaging with Confederate skirmishers just below the crest. Confused, he ordered his men to fall back. The blue troops took heavy casualties doing so, but they eventually made it to the rifle pits. However, there still remained many Federal troops on the ridge who refused to give up the position they had worked so hard to acquire. Sheridan saw his demoralized men retreating and decided to act. He then realized that the rest of the Army of the Cumberland was put in danger upon him retreating. He rode down the line offering encouragement to his men. He promised, "It's all right, boys. When you catch your breath, you can go on again." His men cheered as they got word that they were about to rejoin the assault. Sheridan's men lurched forward again. At this time, Baird's division had just reached the base because of the mangled terrain in their front. Wood's division was halfway up the slope. The Union assault was a mangled mess. One survivor of the assault described it as such. In making the ascent of the ridge, the men naturally sought shelter of the ravines and avoided the backbone of the projecting ridges in order to shelter themselves as far as possible from the enemy's crossfire. Another wrote, "Each battalion assumed a triangle shape, the colors at the apex surrounded by the strongest men, the flanks trailing to the rear." Wood's division in the center of the Union line reached the Confederates on the crest first. The three brigades, entangled in the defiles of the ridge, formed up about 50 yards in front of the Mississippians with a slight rise protecting them. They fixed bayonets and charged into the rebels. Many Southerners simply surrendered where they stood. An officer from Ohio had a man from Mississippi ask, "Captain, I want to surrender. What shall I do?" The officer stated, "Get over them logs to this side. You'll be in the United States then." Some of Tucker's Mississippians began running to the rear. A squad from the 6th Ohio captured a pair of 12-pound Napoleons. The weapons were loaded, but they couldn't find friction primers. One quick thinker yelled, "Stand back," and placed his rifle over the vent of one of the cannons and pulled the trigger. The blast from the rifle ignited the artillery round and sprayed the retreating rebels. To the south, members of the 1st Ohio, 41st Ohio, and 23rd Kentucky planned a charge similar to their comrades. Lieutenant Colonel Langdon ordered the three regiments to fix bayonets, and as he stood up to order the charge, a bullet smashed into his face. He fell to the ground and the men stayed still, not making a sound. Then Langdon rose to his feet, with blood streaming down his face onto his uniform, and said, "I am not killed yet." He ordered the charge, and the Ohioans and Kentuckians captured the works held by Reynolds' brigade. When they topped the ridge, an Ohioan named Levi Wagner was on a mission. He had lost a knapsack at Chickamauga and was determined to replace it with a Confederate one. He continued on over the ridge, captured a rebel, and then found a little plane full of knapsacks that the Southerners had relieved themselves of in the panic. As he said, after looking over a few, I chose one which I thought would supply all my needs. Upon examining my prize, I found a good government blanket, 2 shirts, 2 pairs of drawers, a pair of light summer pants, a nightcap, a plug of tobacco, and a corn pone. General Bragg's line had been broken, and now he needed to stop the Union breakthrough. He pleaded with General Bate on his left to send troops, but Bate was having to fight off Sheridan's division that was fast approaching. Bate then thought of the 60th North Carolina, part of Reynolds' brigade, that had taken up a position behind his men. He ordered them to the north to confront the Yankees, but they would not go beyond where the artillery were emplaced. They were simply too scared. Amazingly, a well-placed Union artillery shell struck the limber behind the North Carolinians, killing horses and men alike. The 60th North Carolina took off in a panic. With a huge gap in the Confederate line and Federals surging through it, Bragg's defeat was imminent. Tyler's brigade of Tennesseans and Georgians held on for as long as they could, but the Federals were beginning to flank them. The Georgians on the far right of Tyler's line gave way as Wagner and Harker's brigades pushed into the Confederate lines. Bragg, mounted on his horse and carrying a flag, attempted to rally the retreating rebels, but the men retreating paid him no mind and continued their withdrawal. After a few moments of watching the battle line melt away, Bragg joined them. Thomas's men had had their rations limited prior to the battle, and many of them started the attack hungry. One soldier recounts what he did upon reaching the top of the ridge. The first thing I did after the rebels skedaddled was to grab a full haversack and jerk it off a wounded rebel captain's neck. He was shot in the shoulder, and his hand lay on the mouth of the haversack on the down hillside. I opened it and divided its contents with my comrades in the immediate vicinity. It was saturated with the rebel captain's blood, but we ate it all the same. To the south, Hooker was pushing through Rossville Gap. Breckinridge had only a small group of Confederates, mostly Holtzclaw's Alabamians, to defend the ridge. Hooker's 3 divisions swarmed up over the ridge and approached the main Confederate line. On the Confederate right, the situation looked dire as rebel brigades dealt with enemy troops in their front and on their left flank. Manigault's brigade attempted to throw up some resistance to the flank attack, but the swelling numbers of Federals disintegrated the gray lines. One by one, regiments gave way to pressure. Dee's brigade, caught off guard and watching their left flank disappear, retreated down the eastern slope of the ridge. General Alfred Vaughn, keeping Phelps' brigade at bay in front of him, sent the 11th Tennessee and the consolidated unit of the 13th and 154th Tennessee to the left in an attempt to stop the Blue Surge. The Tennesseans put up a valiant effort, but they too were sent fleeing. It was now only a matter of Union regiments chasing after the retreating Confederates. Breckinridge and Bragg felt their way through the darkness along with the remnants of their ruined army as they trickled into Georgia. This wouldn't be the last of the Army of Tennessee, but it was a humiliating defeat, and now Chattanooga was firmly in Union hands. A misunderstanding where the attack was to stop resulted in the Army of the Cumberland regaining the honor that some people thought they lost at Chickamauga. Chickamauga, November 25, 1863, 7 p.m. General S. Cooper. After several unsuccessful assaults on our lines today, the enemy carried the left center about 4 o'clock. The whole ground gave way in considerable disorder. The right maintained its ground, repelling every attack. I am withdrawing all to this point. Braxton Bragg. These 4 sentences notified the Confederate government that the Army of Tennessee had been soundly defeated at Chattanooga. The right of the Confederate line on Missionary Ridge under William Hardee and Patrick Cleburne had held and conducted a coordinated withdrawal, which was not the case for the other half of the army. Bragg made his headquarters at Chickamauga Station. Soldiers without companies, regiments, brigades, divisions, or corps to fall in with were mingling about the station. Before midnight, according to Bragg, former Vice President of the United States and one of his corps commanders, John C. Breckinridge, came to Bragg's headquarters and collapsed onto the floor in a drunken stupor. Bragg wanted what was left of his army out of Chickamauga Station on the road to Dalton, Georgia before daylight. He worked tirelessly to make that happen, but because he only had limited time, he had to leave behind vast amounts of food. Bragg ordered the rear guard to burn what couldn't be loaded onto train cars or wagons. The rear guard set the food ablaze, but not before loading themselves down with as much food as they could carry. Sam Watkins from Company H of the 1st Tennessee remembered, before setting fire to the town, every soldier in Maney's and Polk's brigade loaded himself down with rations. It was a laughable-looking rear guard of a routed and retreating army. Every one of us had cut open the head of a corn sack, emptied out the corn and filled it with hardtack, and besides, every one of us had a side of bacon hung to our bayonets on our guns. Our canteens and clothes and faces and hair were all gummed up with molasses. Such is the picture of our rear guard. Philip Sheridan, whose brigades had taken much of the brunt of the fighting for Chattanooga, petitioned his commander to allow him to pursue the retreating rebels. Ulysses S. Grant and George Thomas were both on their way to Chattanooga after inspecting Missionary Ridge, so he asked his corps commander, Gordon Granger. Granger gave permission to Sheridan to pursue, but the darkness and lack of support allowed Sheridan to only go a short distance, not crossing Chickamauga Creek for fear of getting trapped by what was left of the Confederate army on the other side. Patrick Cleburne, the always dependable division commander, was tasked with being the rear guard of the Confederate Army of Tennessee. He and his division were to protect the wagon train and much of the Army's artillery that was trailing the van of the Army. It was a Herculean task, but one Patrick Cleburne was more than willing to take on and perform. A fellow soldier described Cleburne's role. His division, intact from the disasters, was perhaps the only one in the Army to which that responsibility could have been safely entrusted. The trains were toiling forward over a single narrow road, the artillery wheels cutting into the soft mud up to the axles and requiring heavy details to prize them out, and the rear wagon was still in sight when the enemy, flushed with victory and pressing forward in energetic pursuit, appeared and opened on Cleburne with shells. Showing his men at all prominent points to create an impression of greater force, Cleburne gradually fell back toward Graysville. Grant sent Sherman to approach Chickamauga Station from the north, and Thomas consented for Hooker to approach the retreating Confederates from Rossville. The Blue troops were encountering gray skirmishers all day, and the rebels set fire to every bridge that they came across to slow down the approaching Federals. By 10 p.m. on November 26th, the Army of Tennessee was marching toward Dalton, and Cleburne was tasked with protecting the wagon train and, if necessary, sacrifice his division for their safety. The Irishman received an order from headquarters that his men were to march across South Chickamauga Creek, but Cleburne refused. He wagered that he would lose more men through sickness if his men waded through the creek and then bedded down for the night. So he took a big gamble and allowed his men to cross the next morning so they could have a chance to warm up during the day. Later he received another order. It read, "Tell Cleburne to hold his position at all hazards and to keep back the enemy until the transportation of the army is secured, the salvation of which depends upon him." To hold back the Union Army, he would occupy Ringgold Gap with his battered division. The next morning, before dawn on November 27th, Cleburne's men awoke and could see huge bonfires burning on the other side of the creek. Cleburne had ordered the blazes to warm the men after crossing the frigid creek. A member of Cleburne's division remembered, "We took off our shoes, socks, pants, and drawers, tucking the lower ends of our shirts under our belts, clothing and cartridge boxes up under our armpits, waded the creek, this ford being about waist deep while there was ice along the edges of the water, but we hurriedly got into the water after stripping. The cold was stinging our exposed anatomy." Once across, the men warmed themselves by the fires before putting their clothes back on, then marched toward Ringgold Gap. South Chickamauga Creek, the road to Dalton, and the Western and Atlantic Railroad ran through the gap. It was a critical point and one which Cleburne must hold in order for the Army of Tennessee to safely make their escape. Cleburne formed his men in and around the gap, taking advantage of every defile, knoll, and ravine to give his men the best chance against the overwhelming numbers of the Yankees under Joseph Hooker. Osterhaus's division was in the lead and drove back Cleburne's skirmishers, members of the 9th Kentucky Cavalry and the 33rd Alabama. Cleburne placed them alongside the units in the gap and then gazed at the lines of Union soldiers approaching his position. The valley in front was clear of our troops, but close in rear of the ridge, our immense train was still in full view, struggling through the fords of the creek and the deeply cut-up roads leading to Dalton, and my division, silent but cool and ready, was the only barrier between it and the flushed and eager advance of the pursuing Federal army. Charles Wood's Missourians approached the heights and were stunned when the concealed Texans let loose a volley from the timber-covered mountain. The Missourians, taken off guard but ready to attack, launched themselves against the Texans in their front. The Texans' bullets plunged into the blue line, and the steep slope of White Oak Mountain exhausted the Federals. They fell back to regroup amid the hail of lead. Their brigade commander was confident in being able to push any Confederates off the heights. After all, they were the ones who dislodged Confederates from Lookout Mountain. To shore up his line, Woods sent the 29th Missouri to his left. Seeing the movement, the Texans strung out a skirmish line up the mountain to protect their exposed flank. When the Missourians attacked again, the struggle up the slope slowed down the blue troops. The 17th, 18th, 24th, and 25th Texas Dismounted Cavalry Regiments, led by Major William Taylor, charged down the slope, scattering the Missourians in their front. The Federal troops scattered to the town and away from the Confederate defenders. Woods allowed his 3 regiments to pass and then sent the 12th and 3rd Missouri over the same ground that his other 3 regiments were driven from. The 76th Ohio and 1 regiment from James Williamson's brigade, the 4th Iowa, came up on their left, and the 13th Illinois formed on the Missourians' right. The 13th Illinois aimed for the gap. Cleburne watched them as they closed within 50 yards, the enemy not seeing the concealed artillery. He clapped his knee with excitement and said to the artilleryman, "Now, Lieutenant, give it to 'em now." The canister fire and the musketry from the front line Arkansans decimated the 13th Illinois. It became pinned down, just like the Missourians to their left. 76th Ohio and 4th Iowa were approaching the right flank of the Texans, but what they didn't know was that Cleburne had already scouted their movement and sent part of Polk and Lowry's brigades to block the blue troops. As the Ohioans came up, Lowry and Polk placed their troops. The volleys tore into the 76th, and they began to hunker down to withstand the hail of lead. More Confederate troops from Polk and Lowry made it to the top of the mountain, making the musketry more lethal. Seeing the opportunity available to them, Polk ordered the 1st Arkansas to charge down the hill. The Arkansans drove the Ohioans and Iowans off the mountain and back down into the valley below. 8 color bearers and 2 officers were shot down protecting the 76 colors. Although the national colors remained in the regiment's possession, the regimental colors were captured by Polk's men. Hooker then ordered the rest of Williamson's brigade to extend the Union left flank and overlap the Confederates, but the attack stalled out short of the crest. Geary's division made it to the field, and he sent Creighton's brigade up the steep slope to try to outflank Cleburne's line, but Polk and Lowry watched their movement and positioned troops in their way. The blue troops became pinned down, while some ran for their lives down the mountain. Cobham's brigade of Pennsylvanians attacked the mountain, but the attack, like all the others, stalled out as the troops in Cleburne's division used the elevated terrain to their advantage and held the Keystone State troops in place. On the Union right, David Ireland's brigade of Geary's division moved across the open plain behind the 13th Illinois on their way to attack the gap. Hooker wanted them to hold the Confederates in place while the left flank overlapped the Confederates on the mountain. Polk and Lowry were already well prepared on the Confederate right and were blocking any attempt to turn their flank, so Cleburne's forces in the gap were able to concentrate their fire against the new brigade as it swung into their front. The 13th Illinois pulled back when Ireland came to relieve them, but Ireland's brigade came under an intense fire from the troops in the gap and those on Taylor's Ridge. The 16th Alabama came down the ridge and menaced the Federals from behind some buildings that lay at the mouth of the gap. However, Federal bullets sent the Alabamians back up the ridge. Ulysses S. Grant arrived on the field about 11 a.m. and found Hooker sitting on a barrel eating a sandwich and drinking tea as the battle raged. By noon, Hooker and Grant decided against making any more attacks against Cleburne. The Federal troops disengaged with Cleburne and counted their losses. However, Hooker did send Cruft's division around Ringgold Gap, but it would take hours for them to get behind Cleburne's division. Also around noon, Confederate Lieutenant General William J. Hardee sent word to Cleburne that the wagons and artillery had made it safely away and that he could fall back whenever he was ready. Cleburne's division pulled out to catch up with the rest of the army. In the 4-hour fight, Hooker lost 509 killed and wounded, and Cleburne lost 221, only 20 of them being killed. It was an amazing display of generalship on the part of Cleburne, and with that, the Chattanooga Campaign ended. 1864 would bring another campaign, one that would determine the fate of one of the South's largest industrial sites, Atlanta, Georgia.